Is this.
I think it's recording. All right, so this was meant for yourselves. If you want to share it, let's do a quick sharing here of why this day is important and how that should infuse our energy levels and how we're trying to work together today. Anyone want to share something that they wrote about this? David?
I feel like there's these two challenges that we hold that are in direct tension. One is to provide, at a minimum, some clear, concrete pathways or that will have sufficient and sufficiently broad public support that we can actually do them. So we can build confidence in the idea that this plan is meaningful and real. And at the same time, without losing sight of the fact that this is a highly complex set of challenges and that we ultimately, if we're going to be successful, need transformational change in a lot of our policies and lifestyles. So I find it difficult to hold those two things together, but I think we have to do that even though they're in direct tension.
And perhaps this council is a unique place to wrestle with those two things, right? Is there a way to turn this thing off? This is like a transcript that's showing on the side.
Yeah.
I'm not loving it.
Transcript.
Other, Will, and if folks want to introduce themselves just as they're speaking, because online you really don't see very well, but
This is Will from Capstone. So two sayings swirl around in my mind relative to this moment. And one of them is that a goal without a plan is just a dream. But my favorite strategic planner, Mike Tyson, said everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Like at this moment, that's the moment we're in. We have just been punched in the face. And if you look at all the types of things that we thought we were going to do in statute at the federal level, they've essentially been deleted. So this is our opportunity to enshrine something that is actionable that we can do in a way that is going to be able to respond to continued pressure.
right. Chris?
That's kind of a good follow-on to that. So, with the retreat of federal resources, we began to develop an awareness of the need, to develop a plan at the Vermont household municipal level, to prepare for better adaptation, resilience, and recovery. So to that, but yeah, we're about to get punched in the face a hell of a lot harder. And I don't think households and municipalities are at all prepared. So we need to come up with a plan for what happens when we're not getting that money. And one thing I'll just note, so after months of delays on some disaster declarations, the president just made there's not hazard mitigation grant funding going with any of those yet. It's either been denied or under consideration. Well, that would just be a matter of course. And Vermont is heavily reliant on that, both the declarations and that money for hazard mitigation. So that's a huge change.
And one of the things, as you're saying things like that goes into my mind is like, okay, that's a context for us. And then you as a counselor in this moment where you have a sort of unique set of individuals around the table, you're not a legislative body, but you can make thoughtful recommendations. And if you do that in a way that pulls in different people's voices effectively, perhaps you can have great influence outside of this room. Other reflections people had?
I have one. This is Carrick Johnson, EPS Commissioner. I took you at your word. Those two big ifs, right, that introduced what the task was.
Yes.
I went in a very different direction. If those two things are true,
Yeah.
this shining moment, then this is an ever so small beacon of climate light, because it is incredibly difficult and exceedingly rare to have a omnipartisan agreement on how to affordably do climate change. But the revolutionary stuff always starts small. So if we can do that, that'd be great. But I took you at your word with those
Thank
two
you.
ifs.
And I was absolutely doing that on purpose. So
I gathered, yes.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that, right? I really do. Kelly?
Similar to that, but one of the things I wrote down was just that I remain optimistic, and I hope we all do, that we can come up with good solutions without breaking the bank. I think it's gonna take creativity. We're gonna have to rethink how we thought we were gonna pay for things, but I feel like if we can hold that level of, there is a solution out there, we're gonna do it. We might just have to work together and rely on our, Yankee spirit or something rather than, but I think there are ways to do this affordably and make a big difference for Vermonters and the climate.
Anything else? Folks online, if you want to jump in, whether it's Ryan or Dahlia, Eric, feel free. And folks can help me if they raise hands or anything. Okay. Anything else folks want to say before we get going?
I guess one thing I'll say, like, in hearing those that have spoke, it's all along the same lines, right? And we may prioritize differently in terms of what we're saying, but it's very similar to what I wrote, a real and operational plan at a price that Vermont can afford. And hearing that,
That tension that David Muir started us with. Transformational and.
Here we go.
Get it done.
small Mike Tyson quote, I've heard it many times in my career, so it's very appropriate now.
Yeah. It's like, and we can feel it. All right, so we have an agenda for today, and I'm just gonna share it on the screen for a sec. And give me a moment. And I apologize for everyone online. I know Teams is often not folks' favorite collaboration tool for this kind of meeting. This room requires us to use Teams, and that's why we're doing it that way. All right, so we're gonna dive into our usual approval of the minutes kind of thing. I'm walking through the agenda now. We do have some written public comment that's come in. We do a quick shout out to that. Then our first sort of substantive things with our scenario modelers, and I'll let Jane introduce that when we get there. We don't have the output of the model to share today, but I'll let Jane explain that in a little bit more detail. But we have important things to discuss, and we're going to spend an hour on that because it does provide some insights, hopefully, into how we're going to work through our priority actions. We'll take a break a little past 11, and then we're going to dive into finalizing what I call the top 50. And they're not really 50, right? I actually haven't counted them up, but they're in the zone of 50, all right? Our top 50-ish. And we're going to work our way through prior to lunch and a little bit after lunch, the sort of most recent draft of this top 50-ish. And I have a schedule of how I think we're going to do that, so that we feel like we're making some quick wins, but we're also not leaving the hardest stuff until after lunch. So we'll be doing that. And then we'll have some public comment around just past 1 o'clock. So if you're joining us and observing today's quite long meeting, public comment period will be just past 1 o'clock today. And we look forward to input during that. After our afternoon break, we're gonna, at 2:45, we're gonna try this exercise of taking our top 50-ish and seeing if there's a top 10-ish that's gonna emerge, all right? We talked a little bit about how that's gonna happen. We talked to the steering committee about it. We've got a little survey tool that allow you to select a certain number. We'll talk about what that number is. We're gonna have some discussion about the criteria. We're gonna run the exercise. We're gonna talk about it. We're gonna run it again and see what happens and see what emerges in the top 10-ish of our priority actions. We'll talk about next steps and how we're going to finish up this month of June that we are now in. Okay, any questions about our agenda today? Good. Okay, and folks online really do help me out if you need to jump in. Raise your hand, please, counselors online. And folks in the room, let me know if you see hands on the screen. Sometimes I don't have it. Okay, minutes. We do have minutes from the last meeting. They are attached here. They can click right through the agenda to look at them. Does anybody need a little more time to look at them or rather do them in another subsequent meeting? Want for more time? Any concerns or questions about the minutes for those of you who've done a deep dive? Fine. Not hearing requests for time, not hearing concerns. Let's treat those minutes. Thanks. I don't see Sophie here. Oh, you're doing that? Okay. So we do have one written public comment. And it's posted as part of our meeting materials. Jane, is there anything to say about that?
Yeah, I'll just say it's from a woman in Putney, Jacqueline Brook, and it's a wide-ranging comment that speaks mostly to weather and climate science. It's not really relative about the recommendations, but it's really trying to couch the bigger picture around climate science, uncertainties with weather, thing it with impacts on other decision making. So it's there, it's posted, it's long.
Got it.
Encourage folks to look at it.
All right. Do we have our buttons online yet?
Yes.
Okay. So if folks are okay, why don't we start a little early on the, our report from the consultants I'll stop sharing my screen. Jane, can you help us present, our folks and what's going to happen? Okay.
Turn it over.
Sylvia and whoever else is here. Hey, Sylvia.
Hi, Sylvia. Nice to see you. Brian Woods is with us also, who's the Climate Change Mitigation and Modeling Coordinator within the Climate Action Office, is managing the contract with Stockholm Environment Institute. I think many of you know, we had a presentation from SEI around the update to the business as usual model, which looks at current policies in place and the expected emissions reductions we can see over the next 5, 10, all the way to 2050 years with respect to those policies. A lot has been changing, as you can imagine, with federal rollbacks, inclusion of funding, the implementation of Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, that our main policy rulemaking that we've put forward since the last Climate Action Plan. And so Sylvie has been leading updates to that in a continual fashion with respect to understanding what the gap is that we need to close. And what we had hoped to share with you today was two first phase draft of 2 models that look at policies and levers that we can pull at closing the gap between now and 2030, and then a longer timeline set out to meet the 2030 targets in 2035. There's been some delay, as you can imagine, in large part because we've been updating the model, the business as usual model, quite a bit over the last few weeks. And so Sylvie's going to spend some time sharing some updates to the BAU model with you all. And then based on a conversation that we had with some of you as counselors about a week and a half ago on a Friday, about sort of how we build the model to close the gap, Sylvie's really going to set the stage for how SEI is doing that, because I think understanding the choices and how we sort of add up those measures is really important for you all. And we've asked David, and we'll put this forward to the steering committee just for some time next week to actually show you the outputs. But I think that this is a good use of time to really set the stage on how much harder it's actually getting between when we pass the first climate action plan and this current plan to meet 2030. And then setting up an understanding, a commonality across everybody about how LEAP works to actually scenario plan to close the gap. So unless I'm missing anything, Brian, I'm happy to turn it over to SEI for the presentation. Sylvie,
Not
are you
hearing
muted
for-
still? Oh, there you
I'm
are.
here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not hearing
You're
from
here.
Brian, so I'm assuming the floor is ours now. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here joining remotely to present this to you. My name is Silvia Ulloa, and I work for the energy modeling program at SEI. Joining me here today is my colleague Guillaume Bouchard, and a few other colleagues might be joining a bit late, but we'll get started with this presentation. So as Jane mentioned, this will be roughly a 30-minute presentation, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions and discussions. But the idea here is to set the stage for the mitigation scenario modeling that we'll be doing or continuing and finalizing over the next week or so to present hopefully next Monday to the council. So throughout this presentation today, first I'm going to do a very quick recap of what is this model that we're working with and that we're updating to inform this next CAP. And I'll walk you through the updates that we've made to the baseline scenario and show some results both for the economy-wide emissions, but also broken down by sector. We'll compare the updated results to the previous version of the baseline, which was used a few years ago, so you can see also what's changed. And from there, we'll discuss how we're framing the mitigation scenarios and what the modeling process will look like over the next few days. And finally, we'll go over what's next and open the floor for questions. So I'll start here with a bit of background about the model itself. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, this model was developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute about 5 years ago for the state of Vermont through a series of different collaborations. It has been updated already a few times. And in this process, we've been updating the baseline with the latest available data and making sure it's aligned with the most recent emissions inventory for the state of Vermont. The model is built using two tools that have been also developed by SEI, and these are LEAP and NEMO. LEAP stands for the Low Emissions Analysis Platform, and NEMO is the next energy modeling system for optimization. These two tools are widely used around the world, and they are often used in support of national mitigation plans submitted to the UN. In terms of the scope of this model, it has been developed to simulate greenhouse gas emissions across Vermont's entire economy, including both energy and non-energy sectors. It covers all of the major greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, but also local air pollutants. It also models energy consumption and production in all of the different sectors. And for the electricity generation in particular, it uses least cost optimization to model the projected electricity generation and emissions from that sector. In terms of the modeling period, it covers from 2015 to 2050 and has historical data roughly up to 2023 with the actual projections starting in 2024. So even though 2024 is already in the past, we don't have all of the historical information for that year. So that is the first year that is projected in the model.
Sylvia?
Here, yes.
This is Carrick Johnson. Sorry to bug you. A quick question, please.
Yes.
Is there any interconnection between these models and the models on generation and emissions that ISO New England has developed and is utilizing?
We are using for the power sector, we are using information from the ISO New England, but there's no direct connection with the model. We're taking input data from those modeling efforts, essentially. So it's aligned with the latest purchase contracts and all that. So here to the right, you can see the rough outline or structure of this model, where you can see that it covers the different demand sectors: transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, different transformation and non-energy sectors here at the bottom. Now, without going into the details, let me just give you a big picture summary of what's changed in the model. And we've given a couple of presentations previously to the council or to some of you that have a lot more information. But here, just the big picture is that for all sectors that I've showed before, we've updated the historical data that feeds into the baseline. So we've drawn from the most recent versions of reports and other projections, such as the EIA's annual energy outlook, the state energy data system, the Argonne's National Lab vision model for the transport sector. We've also used the latest data from Vermont's DMV registration data, the latest residential and commercial energy consumption surveys. We've used data from the New England Power Pool Information System and the ISO New England models, as we just mentioned. We've used latest statistics from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analyses, the Federal Highway Administration, data from the Vermont Department of Public Service, and many more. So overall, we've done a comprehensive updating of all of this historical information and projections, and we've also aligned emissions with the latest inventory and incorporated all of these new trends and forecasts. Apart from these data updates, we've also made some structural improvements to the model, which really just improve the transparency and will make future updates a lot easier. As Jane pointed out, some of this work is still ongoing, especially we're finalizing the baseline modeling for the commercial sector, where we're incorporating a useful energy analysis for key sectors like heating, and we're also restructuring some building shell categories to make the model more transparent. We're also still finalizing the power sector to better reflect with new targets. And we're setting up some levers to allow for sensitivity analysis around some of these policy uncertainties, like weatherization, the cost of different equipments like heat pumps or appliance efficiency standards, and so forth. So the results that I'll present now are still, as we said, work in progress, but we're not expecting them to change drastically, and we will be focusing more on the modeling of the mitigation scenarios, which we will present next week. So starting again with the big picture, this chart right here shows the updated economy-wide emissions in the baseline. And you'll see here also the statutory targets shown as black diamonds in the chart. So these are, for example, 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and 80% by 2050. And you can see the trajectory of the baseline and how for the historical period, so until 2022 in this case, which is the last year of the inventory, we've calibrated the historical emissions to match those emissions from the inventory in most sectors. And overall, the emissions match exactly in the later years of the inventory, but in the earlier years, there are some differences, particularly in the power sector and the waste sector. Overall, however, the trend in the projections is that emissions will decrease in the baseline from roughly 8.2 million metric tons in 2021 to about 7 million in 2030 and 5.8 million in 2050. So by 2050, we're looking at a drop of almost 30% over this entire period.
Sylvia.
Over the first few years, the
Sylvia.
trajectory, it's, yes.
Sylvia, sorry to bug you.
Yes.
Just a quick question. This is Carrick again. The updates to the commercial and power sector, you don't expect those to appreciably change what that trend is depicting, please?
Yeah, so as you can see, the commercial and the electric sector are not the main contributors to the emissions, right? So there will be some changes or some differences in the final these two sectors, but they won't be too massive. Like in the commercial sector, we're mainly changing the structure of the model. So the projections will slightly change, but not significantly. And in the electric sector, you'll notice here that there are actually some emissions in the electricity sector all the way to 2050, because the actual renewable energy targets, which are now 100% renewable electricity by 2035, had not yet been incorporated here. So if there are any changes, what you will likely see is that the baseline emissions will be slightly lower than what we're showing here. So this would be like a worst case scenario baseline, if you want to look at it like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as I was saying, in the earlier years, the trajectory is more aligned with the statutory targets, but down the road, these are further out of line. And as we said, the baseline projections might decrease a little bit with the updates that we're still working on. Overall, also transportation remains the largest contributor, and even though it declines significantly over time, it still represents almost a third of the 2050 emissions. Now, looking at the sectoral results, as you saw in the previous chart, transportation is one of the main ones, right? So we have a few charts here that will break down what is happening. So for the transportation sector, we used a detailed vehicle stock turnover approach to model all of the road vehicles, and for all of the non-road transport, we used historical trends based on updated historical data. So these two charts right here break down the transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont from two different angles. On the left, you can see the emissions by fuel type, covering all of the transport subsectors. And to the right, you can see for road transport only the breakdown by vehicle class. And this is only for road, but road really represents more than 90% of the total emissions from the transportation sector. So as we mentioned before, overall, the emissions decline throughout the modeling period. And this is despite these projections not accounting for the advanced Clean Cars 2 or the advanced trucks policies. So we showed these results or other results on the May 5th council meeting. And at that point, those policies were included in the results that we showed. But since then, a lot has changed. And so we've removed them. And now the vehicle sales assumptions are based on projections from the AEO 2025 and Vision 2022, which still consider some additional penetration of low emission vehicles, but to a lesser degree and not consistent or compliant with these policies. So if we look at these results by fuel, here on the chart at the left, the use of gasoline declines over time. You can see for diesel, which is this light blue segment over here, remains a large share through 2050. And this is really linked to the freight and commercial vehicles. And as you can see here on the right, the vehicle classes 1 and 2A, which are large SUVs, pickups, and other light trucks, are the largest emitters and also show the biggest reductions. If we look at the heavy trucks, which are broken down by two categories, straight trucks and tractors, but these two combined really also continue to remain significant contributors. And together with the link to the diesel fuel use, this really highlights the need for deeper electrification or alternative fuel adoption in the heavy duty segments. Now, in terms of the vehicle stocks, you can see here the number of vehicles in Vermont broken down by weight class and by technology. There is overall a slight decrease over time in the total number of vehicles, mainly from the class 1 and 2A category, as we saw before. And if we look at this by technology, you see that the gasoline vehicles, so this orange segment, has the or sees the sharpest decline as these vehicles are mainly replaced by alternative technologies like EVs, but also more hybrids and plug-in hybrids.
Julie,
As I me-
this is Julie. Are you able to speak to why you anticipate the number of vehicles will decline?
Well, this is as again based on the sales from the AO 2025 and Vision 2022, and most likely it already assumes that in the baseline there are other modes of transport, and there's densification of cities and other types of policies that are happening, even though, or other types of changes in behavior that are happening even in the absence of explicit policies. So these are just following the overall trends that we see in those big reports and projections at the national level. So this dotted line that you see here, this black dotted line, as I said, we had previously presented the results of the baseline that incorporated the implementation of advanced clean cars 2 and clean trucks. So this line here shows the stocks of electric vehicles that were previously modeled with these policies. So you can compare this dotted line to the now green segment here, which shows the stock of EVs without these policies. And this is the impact that removing those policies had in the model. In terms of emissions, this basically resulted in about 7.2 million metric tons of cumulative emissions over the modeling period. Moving on to the next
Hey, Sylvie.
sector. Yes.
Joey has a question, and I might proactively just state that the removal of ACC2 and ACT is consistent with all baseline modeling across states that have those rules on the books. So I know there were some questions about the uncertainty about what's going to happen with ACC2 and ACT in light of what's deemed largely illegal by the way the Trump administration has perceived with the CRA vote. But it was consistent across the states that have these rules on the books that they would be removed from modeling. And that's the way the US Climate Alliance is dealing with it also. So I just want to say that Vermont is not an outlier in taking these off. And I think we expect, or we hope maybe is the better word, that something will come back, but understanding the timeline and trajectory, it will likely look different than what ACC2 in particular looks like.
Thank you, James.
Following up on that, helpful to know, would it be possible to model it with advanced clean cars and trucks as well, considering the uncertainty? I mean, I see the differential here, and maybe that.
It's still in our model, and Sylvie can speak to this, or Brian better. I mean, all of these levers can be turned on or off. We've built a model that's very adaptive, so it's we can always turn it back on or do something different, but right, for the sake of planning or how to close the scenario, I think it's consistent to plan without it.
And just to be clear though, Joey, right, this is the baseline. It's not about the measures that would be modeled.
Yeah,
right?
no,
So
I
you can
understand.
model the measure of doing something like ACC2 or ACT. It's just a question of what's in the baseline.
No, I get that. I think it may be helpful to be more clear about that. And maybe in the section 2 where you talk about the changes to the baseline, it would be helpful to call out that in those bullets that advanced clean cars and trucks is proactively stripped out because of federal uncertainty, or just stripped out. I don't know. I would raise it to be clear about that.
Thanks, Joey.
That's a massive differential.
And look, let me grab Chris, and I see Matt Coda's got a hand up as well. Chris, go ahead.
Sylvia, do demographics play into this at all? Demographic projections?
For the trans.
I'm
Sorry.
thinking
were you-
age of drivers, anticipated birth rates, death rates, I've always wondered this and now I got a chance to ask. Does it factor in at all?
Not directly in our model. So for the transport in other sectors, as you'll see, yes, the emissions are the modeling of the energy consumption, and therefore the emissions are directly driven by population and other drivers. In this case, for the transportation sector, the model uses this stock turnover model. So we model the existing stock based on the DMV vehicle registration as of 2023. And then we use projections of vehicle sales of different categories. And those are coming from the larger national-wide exercises of the AEO, and it's downscaled to Vermont in particular. So most likely population projections and economic considerations and all of that are driving the projections in the AEO, and those are being used by our model, but we're not linking it directly to population. But I'm sure that those are driving some of those trends in the AEO as well.
Matt Coda, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize not being in person. I'll be there this afternoon, traveling now. But similar to Chris's question, given that there are some policy levers outside of this discussion to increase the population of Vermont, increase the number of housing, and presumably the number of vehicles on the road, what is the projection on where we are going in the state of Vermont in terms of population and housing units and cars?
We do include population growth in this model. And so Sylvie can talk a little bit about that.
I don't know if you heard that, Matt, but population growth is incorporated into the model. Sylvia, can you say a word about it?
Yes, actually, I might ask Guillaume to update us on what the source of those projections is. But yes, population projection is a part of the model and has been updated with the latest statistics and projections. Guillaume, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So as Sylvia and others have noted, we do have, and if I understand correctly, Matt, your question is about what the model predicts Vermont's population will be. And I can share.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I want to know what the model is predicting, where we'll be at in 5 years, 10 years, whatever the time frame is. Increasing growth, decreasing, or staying the same, and what percentage?
So the Department of Health historical data, they list is in the model from Vermont's Department of Health. The population projections are from the University of Virginia Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, and those are national state level population projections, and the population stays approximately flat. So you're still looking at something on the order of 630, getting close to 640,000 people by 2050. So if there are major, policy changes or drivers, that would trickle through in a future update. But for now, that's what is reflected. And then likewise, housing units are modeled to grow according to the population.
Just one quick follow up, and then I'll be quiet.
Yeah, please.
So is it safe to assume that if our population were to grow, that the amount of greenhouse gases emitted would increase?
I think that's a bigger question for you all to consider as you do this exercise. It certainly depends on where new households are added. And I think it's safe to say that that should be the end of my answer as a technical.
Thank you.
That was great. Peter Sterling, you had a hand up.
Thanks. I am not an expert on transportation issues by a long stretch, but when I look at this chart, I see that we have about 600,000 cars right now, and this model says we're gonna have about something on order of 500,000 cars in 25 more years. 100,000 cars are gonna go away. I don't see that as, that is possible. Model based on greenhouse gas reductions. 100,000 cars going away seems like a bit of a stretch.
Right, and the folks have spoken about the source of the data used for those kinds of projections. Jared, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd be particularly curious to know in the AEO data is what they're assuming with relation to the rise of things like on-demand transit, microtransit, driverless vehicles, things that have, there's a lot of literature on the possibility for significant reductions in the number of vehicles as the population is staying the same or going up because of more efficient use of vehicles. So, whether or not those have, whether and to what degree those are relevant for Vermont, I think is a really fair and important question. But I think that might give us some light on why are we seeing modeled vehicle reductions alongside flat population. There may be a technological answer in terms of what people are expecting from transit and vehicle options.
I mean, that's a pretty big percentage drop in the number of cars in Vermont in not a very long time.
Right. So Chris, if you want to talk about that, and then I want to say, this is tricky for us because we don't have the actual data source in front of us. So what if we noted this as something that caught your attention? And that Sylvia, you all can go back and do a little bit of deep dive and then explain why that data source is creating that result. Chris?
Because to me, I mean, where my planner hat, which is always on, it also, to me, have to assume like major infrastructure investments that make compact settlement way beyond what we currently have possible. So people do not have to drive as much. So it's not just, it can't just be mode switching. It's got to be, we have accomplished something that heretofore we're still trying to figure out. And I don't know, maybe the chip bill will figure it all out, but but anyway, that to me, that's a big assumption. It'd be helpful to know more about what that is, especially in our rural context. I know that can't answer everything, but it'd just be good to kind of know what the assumptions are.
Right. So let's take that back as a to-do when the next time we talk about this,
Yeah.
to explain what feels a little bit, odd for folks. I want to make sure we get time to go through. I think you have quite a bit of other slides, so let's roll
Yes.
through and then let's see. I want to have us have a little bit of time to talk about what this all means as it relates to our work today. Sylvia, why don't you keep rolling?
Thanks. Yeah, and all of those are very useful feedback and recommendations. And as we said, transportation is really one of the main ones. So we really want to make sure that we understand what's going on and that we have reasonable projections, since it has so much weight in what happens and so much potential for mitigation as well. We'll follow up on those observations, and it's also probably useful to include an indicator that shows the number of vehicles per person, roughly, as an indicator of how that varies over time to reflect the trends on both things. So we'll make sure to add that. And so moving on quickly through the next few sectors, which contribute to a lesser extent to the overall emissions. Here you can see for the residential sector, so in this sector, emissions decline steadily, and most of these emissions really come from space heating, especially from heating oil. And what really is playing a big role here is in reducing these emissions over time is the high adoption of heat pumps, which we're seeing in the last few years, but also projected further into the rest of the modeling period. The water heating also remains a notable source, while other end uses like cooking are comparatively minor. Similarly, in the commercial sector, these remain relatively flat in the baseline. And again, space heating is the main driver, with natural gas and heating oil as the key fuels that are generating these emissions. In the industrial sector, we see slight emissions growth over time, which are mostly driven by the use of diesel and natural gas in this sector. And then in the non-energy sector, the expected trends remain mostly flat. And these projections from the non-energy sectors are based on the EPA's state inventory tool. You can see also the comparison to the emissions inventory for each of these different subcategories of non-energy. And you'll see that in particular for the waste sector, which is this one at the top, the emissions from the model differ slightly from the inventory. And this is because of how the model treats the combustion emissions from certain wastes like plastic, synthetic rubber, and fibers, which are non-biogenic in line with the IPCC guidance. But in the emissions inventory, these are all of the emissions from the waste sector are assumed to be biogenic, so they are not counted towards the total emissions, and that's the reason for this difference that you see over here. Now, taking a step back again to show the economy-wide results, here's how the updated baseline compares to the previous baseline version from 2023. So the chart here to the left shows this new baseline, the results that I've just presented, with the white dotted line over here representing the gross emissions from the previous baseline, which is also shown here to the right with the detailed breakdown of all of the sectors. So you can see side by side how these have changed. You'll note here that in this updated baseline, the projections are generally higher. So in 2030, they are around 7% higher than the previous baseline, and in 2050, about 20% higher. You'll also see that the updated baseline also aligns much better with the emissions inventory, particularly in the recent years. And the main differences or the main reasons for these differences in the two baseline come from the orange segment here, which is the transportation sector. So if we take a closer look at some of these, at some key years in this comparison, starting in 2022, you can see the previous baseline broken down by sector next to the updated baseline and the emissions inventory. So a pretty good alignment, with the main difference being the waste sector, as we discussed earlier. And moving forward on the 2030 and 2050 results, you see that the updated baseline has higher emissions, mainly with differences in the transportation sector, which reflects the newer data, and again, the removal of the advanced clean cars and clean trucks policies that reflect these real world updates and on the policy impacts that they have.
Can you talk a little bit about electricity generation and why that's such a significant increase by 2050?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're still finalizing the updates to the electricity generation sector. So we have incorporated the most recent contracts, and we started incorporating also the most recent renewable energy standard target, which requires 100% of renewable electricity by 2035. And what we found is that there are some contradictions between the two, between the contracts and the actual amounts of renewable electricity that is required. So at the moment, the projections that you see for the electricity generation sector consider the earlier renewable electricity targets, which was 75% by 2032. And correct me if I'm wrong with this, Guillaume. So that is why by 2050, there you still see significant, I would say, emissions from the electricity generation sector. But once we incorporate that updated target of 100% renewable by 2035, this will basically come down and will be zero. So that is why this you see this chunk of emissions in the electricity generation, because it's still not reflecting the 100% renewable starting in 2035.
Okay.
Chris?
So does the model, is it able to take into account, and maybe it's not meaningful enough, but like homes lost to disaster and then also waste produced as a result of cleaning up post-disaster?
It's not included in the model explicitly at this time, no.
But it, like in your modeling generally, not just in Vermont, but in other states, is that have you begun factoring that in?
No, I haven't seen it incorporated, but that is something that we could potentially discuss if it's important. We could discuss on different ways in which it could be incorporated. I mean, we could incorporate some assumptions, but that would probably be for a later exercise.
Sylvia, are you
Interesting,
taking
though.
into account in the modeling the impact of weatherization in the residential sector?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, we are.
With the projection of the current scope or with the weatherization at scale modeling?
So there is some weatherization assumptions in the baseline already, but as I'll show in some of the next slides, that is also one of the mitigation measures that we are exploring that will come into play in the mitigation scenario. So higher ambition in terms of weatherization and other policies, but something that we are not modeling, and this is something that came up in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, is that we are assuming that for all of these mitigation measures, and we'll go through this in some of the next slides, so maybe I'm getting ahead, but we are assuming that there are funds available to implement these measures, and we are not considering any constraints, for example, in terms of the labor that is required to implement these weatherizations or other types of restrictions that might exist in terms of the implementation of these policies.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Jared, and then I want to make sure we get to the part about, you know, how they're modeling out to 2030 and
I just want to note two things quickly, and please correct me, Sylvia, if any of this, if it's inconsistent with your understanding. But one thing that I think is important to keep in mind as we look at the transportation sector and the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector is that as that modeled fuel switching is happening, emissions from electric vehicles, emissions from heat pump water heaters will no longer show up in the transportation or in the RCI sector. Any emissions associated from them would now be in the electricity sector. So some folks might be saying, oh, we see all those gas and diesel vehicles modeled as going down, but where are the emissions, if any, from EVs showing up? And there would be kind of a sector switch in the modeling. So we would look to those in the electricity sector. And historically, Vermont's emissions in the electricity sector really come from two sources. The vast majority is from the purchases of residual system mix from ISO New England, which is fairly heavily fossil fuel. But with the updates to the RES, that should either go to zero or we should only be purchasing residual mix if there's a time, which I don't foresee anytime soon, where that residual mix would be 100% renewable. But it wouldn't, my understanding is that it wouldn't actually go to zero though, because we also count in the electricity sector emissions from wood-based electricity generation, which could count under the RES, but produces methane and nitrous oxide emissions that would be counted. So it does look to me like this has not been updated and needs to be updated to reflect the 100% RES, which should bring it near zero, but not exactly zero, because there will still be wood emissions.
You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It will be near zero, probably not exactly zero. And also because there are some contracts that are also for non-renewable qualified processes. And you're also absolutely right on how the model works. And that's actually one of the of the advantages of looking at the different policies in an integrated framework or an integrated model such as this, because you can then explore or analyze or account for the interconnections or the implications that one policy might have on another policy, or that policies on one sector might have on a different sector. Like the examples that you gave, if a lot of the mitigation measures are reliant on electrification in the residential, in the transportation sector, what you're doing is that you're shifting those emissions from happening in those end use sectors to the power generation sector. So the actual amount of mitigation that you get is really dependent on what is happening in the electricity generation. If there aren't renewable energy standards in place, or if there isn't like a high penetration of renewable electricity in the power generation sector, you're just moving the emissions from the end use sectors to the electricity generation, but they could still be significant emissions happening there as a result of all of these electrification policies. So that's why it's important to look at the big picture and how the different sectors interact with each other.
Sylvia,
Let
this
me-
is Garrett. One quick follow-up question, if I may, please.
Yes.
So, and I should know this, I apologize, but is nuclear considered clean for the purposes of this modeling?
That's a good question, and I'll ask Guillaume to confirm that. I'm not sure if it's totally considered as renewable qualified, or if only
It is not.
it's not. There you go. It is
So
not.
because it's not in the res, it doesn't get counted in that way.
In the model, it's not whether or not it's renewable, it's what the emissions profile of the source is.
Update it to the res, which is 100% renewable by 2035 without nuclear.
But I'm just saying historically, though,
Baseline, yeah,
those emissions wouldn't show up either because
baseline will be.
There's a difference between renewable and low carbon or no carbon.
I understand all
They're
that.
not mutually exclusive.
So this modeling, what,
Let's maybe Guillaume can give us the definitive on this. What happens with nuclear power emissions in this model?
That is a good and a different question. So in terms of whether or not generation from nuclear would be allowed under the RES, as was currently modeled, my answer to that is no. As far as what emissions are modeled from nuclear in the baseline, I'd have to double check with you and come back to that. I want to make sure I get that answer correct.
Right. Thank you.
Can I ask
one final question? We're just sticking with the council for now, but thank you. We'll definitely have time for public comment on this.
Two questions and unrelated, but maybe you'll get to some of this later. Just curious if you will speak to the role of biofuels. I thought in the presentation that we got a week and a half ago that it was more significant share than had been modeled before. And then also, will we see at some point the assumptions of the different GHG benefits and the cost effectiveness of various strategies to understand the assumptions and the inputs here?
Well, I think what we want to do is get to the storyline about how they model strategies. Like that's what we're trying to get to today. So if we let them get there, we will get there.
Just the baseline.
Yeah, we're just talking baseline right now. So if we can get to the how they're going to model strategies, we may get to these answers.
Yes, then let's move to that bit of the presentation now. But it's great to see so much interest and food for thought as we finalize the baseline projections as well. So with these baseline projections nearly complete, we're now quickly moving into the modeling of the mitigation scenarios. So as some of you know already from a presentation that we gave a couple of weeks ago, we've reviewed and updated about 21 mitigation measures that cover really all of the different sectors. And I'll show you what those are in the next slide. But the idea is that we will use these individual, let's say, mitigation actions to model two different scenarios. One that hits the 2030 target of 40% below 1990 and the 80% reduction by 2050. And another scenario that delays the 2030 target by 5 years. So it's reaching the 40% reduction by 2035 and still hits the 80% reduction by 2050. So this chart right here shows you the gross baseline emission projections here, the black line at the top, together with the statutory target. So in this case, the 40% reduction by 2030 and 80% reduction by 2050, and an approximate trajectory with the line here in gray of what we should be seeing in order to meet those targets. So you can see that to meet this 2030 target, there's 1.6 million metric tons that need to be avoided compared to the baseline. That's roughly 24% of the baseline emissions. And by 2050, we would need around a 70% cut from the baseline, which is equivalent to approximately 4 million metric tons. And you can also see the effect of delaying that 2030 target by 5 years. So this space in gray here in the middle is really the mitigation gap that we need to address through all of these mitigation actions in order to meet those statutory targets. So how will this mitigation be achieved in those mitigation scenarios? So what we will do is that we will model these two scenarios by layering individual mitigation measures on top of the baseline and exploring their emission reduction potential. So as we said, modeling all of these different sectoral strategies in an integrated model like this one lets us account for these synergies and interactions that occur between the measures and the sectors, in particularly between demand and supply. As we said, a lot of these electrification measures will have very different impacts depending on the carbon intensity that we see on the power sector. And in some cases also there are measures or strategies that are affecting the same sectors or end uses, like in the heating space, for instance, there's adoption of less carbon intensive heating technologies like heat pumps, but also wood heating, and also the introduction of biodiesel in heating oil. And of course, the impact of this will be different depending on the levels of penetration of each of these measures and how they interact with each other. So this slide right here shows the 21 measures that we have presented a couple of weeks ago. So I won't go into the details of these, but each one of these measures has a set of assumptions around their implementation levels and their trajectories, and you can refer to the slides of that presentation for the details. But I'll just point that many of these measures align really with the CAP recommendations. For example, we have in the transport sector the phase out of the ICE sales by 2035, which is in line with the recommendation of continuing to monitor and maintain Vermont's adoption of the California Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks. We also have in the transport sector VMT reductions, which speaks to the need to invest in public and multimodal transportation, such as transit and microtransit, passenger rail, biking, more walking, all of that. Other strategies in the transport sector relate to biodiesel and ethanol in the fuels, which are aligned with the recommendation to analyze options for clean fuel standards. And as we touched briefly on weatherization, we've also included that for the residential sector, and that's related to the recommendation of securing funding for a comprehensive weatherization focusing on low and moderate income households. So a lot of these measures relate to those recommendations in the CAP, and the process that we will follow to build these mitigation scenarios is outlined here. So what we will do is that we will prioritize the measures based on their cost effectiveness. So in terms of their dollars per ton of CO2 avoided, considering these costs or savings over the entire modeling period. This costing and the partial, let's say, prioritization that we will do of all of these measures will be determined by running each of these mitigation actions individually to estimate this cost per ton, but that excludes any interactions between the measures. So that's a caveat. So once we have run each of these measures individually, we will estimate the cost per ton. And that's why we're saying this will be a partial prioritization, because it's not yet considering those interactions until we put all of them on top of each other and run a scenario with all of the measures included at once. As I said, this also assumes that there are funds available for implementing these measures. So once we have prioritized them, what we will do is that we will add measures in order of increasing cost, using as a starting point the ramp rates and the implementation levels that we presented a couple of weeks ago. And every time we add a new measure, we will compare the results to the emission targets, and we will continue to add measures on top of each other until those targets are met or exceeded, hopefully. Now, if all of those measures are used and we're still not meeting the targets that we need to in order to meet those statutory targets, then we will revisit the implementation levels and we will consider higher ambition for some of these measures, of course, up to a ceiling. And we will start that process again from the least cost measures and move towards the more costly measures. So that's roughly the process that we are following now. And before we go to a few more questions or discussion, looking ahead, basically what we will present next week at the June 9 Climate Council meeting will be the results of this exercise and the results of the mitigation scenarios, where we will share some additional details on this prioritization of the measures, the cost effectiveness that was calculated for each one, how they were prioritized, which ones were included in each of the two scenarios, and with what level of implementation, as well as the mitigation that is achieved both overall for the economy, but also for each of the different sectors, how they contribute to the emission reductions. And we can include also other additional metrics like energy use, or how we discussed earlier, other indicators like the number of vehicles per person and other indicators that might be helpful to better understand and interpret the results. So I'll stop there. We still have, I think, a few more minutes for discussion and questions around the process that we will follow for coming up with those mitigation scenarios, which will hopefully set the floor also for the discussions that you'll have later today. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Sylvia. All right, so we don't have it yet, but in theory, we have it next week. Rich?
I just assumed you were gonna ask.
Yeah, questions?
Yes, I have a question. Sylvia, I've expressed previously that I like to prioritize, at least initially, by cost per ton avoided. I think that's our charge. But I have a question about how cost per ton avoided is calculated. For example, some measures, weatherization, heat pumps, et cetera, avoid fossil fuel costs. And so the net cost per ton avoided needs to consider both the cost of the measure and the benefits of the avoided fossil bill. And
That's correct.
so one question is, are you doing that? And a related question is that some measures have health benefits from reduced air pollution in particular that in some models are pretty substantial. And I wonder whether you're including that in your net benefit calculation. And I'm going to assume that when you question is, I assume that when you do social cost of carbon, that when you do cost per ton avoided, you don't, for this purpose, you don't need to include a social cost of carbon, which would apply to every ton in the cost per ton arena, but that it would be important to know, including the social cost of carbon, what is the net cost of a measure? So that was 3 questions. And you helped me out in understanding how you're going to do it.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. So we have, okay, I was just confirming that I wasn't muted. So we have incorporated cost information throughout the model. So there's costing data for the fuels per se. So we have also projections on the fuel costs for each of the different fuels that are consumed in the model, but we also have cost information on the demand side or on the technology side. So you're right that the costing will be a balancing act between the savings that you get in some sectors and the increased cost that you get in other sectors related to the costs of infrastructure or more expensive equipment and how that balances things. So when we look at this overall cost effectiveness of the measures, those costs take into account the overall cost throughout all of the modeling period and considering the cost from all of those different categories. So if we look at a breakdown of how those costs evolved over time, we might see that in some, like on the supply side, we might have significant savings, but on the demand side, we have additional cost. In some cases, those might make the mitigation action to be really cost effective and have a net saving. In other cases, there might still be a net cost for implementing that measure, and that's part of what we will be exploring. So in short, yes, the cost effectiveness will consider all of those different cost categories, including the cost of the equipment, infrastructure, and the fuels. It does not, however, include the health, an estimation of the cost of the health benefits. And when it comes to air pollution, it is definitely something that could be included in the model, but it is not included at the moment. And one way to do that would actually be introducing a social cost of carbon, which is again not included right now because we have costing throughout the model for each of these different types of or categories of costs, not like a big umbrella of costs under a social cost. So the different cost categories are modeled separately. But that said, the social cost of carbon and the estimation of the benefits in terms of air pollution is something that could potentially be included down the road, and the model tools have definitely capability for doing that.
So just to add to that, just so I think I said this last week, but I just want to reinforce that many of the air pollution measures are really positive for public health. There are some like wood and pellet and biogas that are actually worse. So I think there's also balancing there on outdoor and indoor air quality, reducing propane cooking indoors for indoor health and asthma incidence is good. increasing wood stove use is bad. So it is, there's fun
Go both
tension
ways.
there. Yeah.
Another couple questions, Julie, and then Julie.
Sylvia, when you say infrastructure, are you talking about things like service panel upgrades and EV charging infrastructure being sort of factored into the cost where you need so many EV charging stations per 100 EV vehicles placed into service and some recognition that many of Vermont's homes currently can't support heat pumps without a service panel upgrade? Is that sort of all tucked under that umbrella of infrastructure?
Exactly. Yes, in particular for the electric vehicles, since there's a lot of them basically that will be coming in with this mitigation measure of phasing out ICEs. There is an increased cost, or the cost of those charging infrastructure is considered as part of the costs that's required for that mitigation measure.
Julie?
I have something just directly.
I just.
So two things, this is what I was asking earlier about, just if you can speak to a little more detail about the role of biofuels in terms of it playing a bigger role. I thought I had understood that from the last meeting. And then also, if you can go back a couple of slides to your mitigation measure slide, this one. Oh, that one. I'm just curious, it was different than the one you presented on May 23rd. And I'm just wondering if it's just shorthand or if like you spoke to it, but it's not showing up here that heat pump space heating is not on this list, but I've heard you say it, and I think it is a significant. So just curious the differential between the mitigation measures you outlined on May 23rd and what's showing up here, because I feel like this slide is missing some key things. Right, it's only in the commercial, but it needs to be in the, I'm just curious why.
Yeah, so on the biofuels, there are a few different measures here related to biofuels. So there's the higher blending of biodiesel in the heating oil. There's this cross-cutting measure of B20 biodiesel, but in particular sectors, there's even a higher blending. So for example, 100% blending for heating, for heavy duty vehicles as well. In industry, there's also blending of ethanol. So this cross-cutting one would apply to all of the different sectors, but there are also different specific measures that apply to some sectors with more aggressive ramp rates and penetration levels. And you're right, a couple of weeks ago, we presented a list of 23, I believe, measures. So there's a couple that we've removed because they are no longer relevant. For example, you'll see that in the power generation, we had an additional measure of 100% renewable electricity. I can't remember what the target year was, but since that will be now incorporated as part of the baseline, it's no longer a mitigation measure per se, since it's incorporated for the baseline projection. So we've removed it. Similarly to in the residential sector, we initially had heat pump space heating both in the residential and the commercial, and now you'll see it's only showing up under commercial. And this is again because the residential sector projections in the baseline already consider a very, very aggressive penetration of heat pumps already in the baseline. Basically, most of the households will have heat pumps by 2050. At least that's what the projections that we found seem to indicate. So again, this measure of increasing the ambition no longer makes sense. So we've excluded that couple of measures since those have been integrated into the baseline projections, and that's the reason why you're not seeing them here anymore.
That's super helpful, but just for transparency so that the public can understand that, because I feel like that we need to be clear, like we are gonna be relying on a significant deployment of heat pumps, but it's a little confusing here.
Yeah.
But that's very helpful context. I very much appreciate it.
Right. Or maybe you leave it in here and you recognize when you do it in your modeling, it's aligned with.
Not adding any.
Yes, okay.
The HQ.
All right, and by the way, on the importance of biogas or biodiesel, I think Joey, to the point of like the importance, the modeling will determine whether it's important or not, right? Whether it's cost effective or not to have biofuels, right? This doesn't say whether it's going to be a winner or not. This just says it's among the measures that they're going to test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big part of our job is to like put finger on the pulse of things we'd like to see more of. And I think public input and to the public health pieces of, I just want to make sure that our thumb is on the scale of the things that not only are cost, which ultimately should be more cost effective.
Hey, can I just, and I was gonna go here, but then Sylvia went right exactly there. Can you give me a bit more on the benefits of an early HQ exit, please?
HQ?
Hydro-Quebec.
Sorry.
Yes, that's a good question, and I'll probably ask Guillaume to weigh in on this since you've worked with the power sector a bit more, Guillaume.
Yeah, so let me take,
I'm sorry that I jumped in front of you in the first place. I saw you had your hand up, so sorry about that.
no, it's okay. No worries about that, Commissioner Johnson. I just wanted to make sure I came back to your earlier question about nuclear. So there are no GHG emissions from nuclear modeled in the model. That said, it is not, eligible under the RES, and it is also modeled as such. So just want to make sure we had a clarity on that.
Yep.
And then we also have a question in the chat that I'll take now since it's related to the power sector. Does the model include energy storage as a component in renewable energy generation? So the model does include several storage technologies, and they are rated renewable if and only if the electricity or energy that went into storing into storage was renewable. On the early HQ exit, in the model, under that scenario, it's a bit outside of the scope since we're primarily discussing the baseline here, but essentially that is replaced by the least cost electricity generation technologies after that date. And so, exiting in 2030 rather than 2038 means that for those 8 years, you're going to see growth in the model in technologies such as solar and wind, which might be less costly to Vermonters.
Chris, Rich,
Hey, I'm just gonna, thank you, Guillaume. I'm just gonna say, okay, whoa, all right? At a certain, there is this thing called reliability that we need, and I'm gonna put a placeholder there on that. How's that?
Great. And you'll notice it's not in. It's not,
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
Well, that's why Liz and I went, wait.
yeah, it's not in here.
Okay. Not amped up.
Chris, Jared, and then we're gonna need to go to a break. Chris, and then Rich is there too, sorry.
So in the model, little context, so everywhere else I've worked where you have farmland conversion to residential, right? Because I'm not talking, like oftentimes in Vermont, what we seem to have, at least in our region, it's not land conversion for like larger scale residential development. It's more McMansions up on the mountainsides. Everywhere else I've lived, there's been a major conversion of farmland to residential. Why? Because farmland perks and it's easy to develop. So I'm trying to figure, one of the things I'm wondered, because when you look at like non-energy and like especially the dairy sector, which is undergoing profound change. And because one of the questions I keep asking is, are we tracking rates of conversion of farmland or sale of farms? Because I would love to also be able to track, like, are we starting to see X farm now owned by, Green Acres LLC out of Connecticut? Does the model take into account any kind of agricultural conversion to residential? Or is the assumption that the status quo is what it is and that's what it's going to be?
Yes, that's a very good question. So the model currently includes emissions from the LULUCF sector. So that's land use and land use change and forestry. We didn't show them in the results for the non-energy sector today because we're focusing on the emission on the sectors that are contributing mostly to the gross emissions, and the LULUCF sector currently is projected to continue to be a sink of emissions. So the model most certainly includes them, and you can see with those results enabled, you can see what the net emissions are, taking into account the emissions from all of these other sectors that we showed, and the sinks that you still see in the LULUCF, even though those are projected to be shrinking over time, but are still considered to be a sink. So we didn't show them, but yes, the model does consider those emissions from the LULUCF sector, but those are not really considered for the purposes of achieving the mitigation that we're looking for in these scenarios.
Ask a quick follow-up.
Super quick, because we do need to take a break.
So just based on your knowledge, because I've been trying to get an answer to this too. If, especially when it comes to dairies, if you convert a dairy farm to residential, is that a net gain or net loss of mitigation or greenhouse gas production?
Can we get an answer back to you on that?
Yeah, that'd be fine. I just would love an answer at some point.
Let's get an answer back on that. Jared and Rich, last questions.
Yeah, two things, and I've shared this with a smaller group, but they're two of the most important things that I want to underline as we move towards finalization of the modeling, especially as it relates to cost effectiveness. And the first is, as I heard it, Sylvia, correct me if I get this wrong, but I think I heard you say that you're looking at cost effectiveness or dollars per ton weighted over the modeling period. And I just want to make sure that if we're looking at annual emissions, we're also annualizing costs. So just for context, especially for newer counselors, what happened in the previous iteration of this modeling is that there are some measures with a large upfront cost, like weatherization. It might be $10,000, $12,000 in upfront cost, but will then reduce emissions for 30 years. And in the cost effectiveness modeling, if you're going out to 2050 and you do a weatherization project in 2049, that full cost is getting booked, but you're only getting 1 year of emissions reduction. And so I think it's really important in order for us to have an apples to apples comparison of looking at annual emissions and annualized costs, that we deal with those end effects issues so we don't see that come up in this version of the cost effectiveness modeling the way that we did in the previous version. And then the other thing that I think is a really important update since the last time is that my recollection is that there was almost either zero or very little renewable diesel modeled, which, as folks may know, is a drop in fuel replacement for diesel that doesn't require equipment upgrades the way that biodiesels, certainly B100 biodiesel often does. And given the amount of 100 that's modeled across the mitigation scenarios, I think given the increases in the actual and projected supplies of renewable diesel, it's important to account for that, because otherwise we would be counting, to Secretary Moore's point, a lot of infrastructure upgrades that may not be necessary to accommodate B100 biodiesel. So those are two things that I think could end up having important effects on the results, and I want to make sure that they're addressed up front. Thank you.
Thanks. And Rich,
Thank you. And I'll just react very quickly to the comment on the cost effectiveness and how we're calculating that. So yes, I'm not so familiar with the issues that you had with the previous versions of the model, but here we are considering annualized costs, and we are comparing the discounted costs throughout all of the modeling period across the different scenarios. Now, I will say that this cost effectiveness estimation and the prioritization that we will be doing of the measures will be somewhat different to what was done before. And Brian and Jane can jump in here to add a little bit more context, but I know that there were some previous exercises where some marginal abatement cost curves were determined and further explored. So that was, I guess, a more thorough analysis of the costing of the measures and the methods that were used for getting to those results and cost effectiveness estimation is different to what we will be doing here, which will be an individual or independent evaluation of each of the measures. So you will see that the results of this cost effectiveness will most likely be different from the MAC exercise that some of you might be familiar with that happened some time ago.
Thanks, Lydia. Rich, last word on this?
Yeah, again, a question about the mitigation measures regarding heat pumps. If you go back to your list, you modeling fossil water heating and also fossil cooking phase out, presumably, using, new electro technologies. And so they're not in the baseline. The baseline assumes that a mitigation is needed. But for heat pump space heating, your answer to Joey's question was, oh, we assume it basically we're getting such a high penetration of heat pumps for space heating in the baseline that we aren't modeling a heat pump program. I find that confusing, that you think that the market is going to deliver whole house space heat pumps to such a degree, whereas the market isn't apparently delivering in the baseline heat pump water heaters or heat pump induction stoves. And I don't know why we would have such great success on space heating and not on the others. And I just wonder why it's baked into the baseline so optimistically. It's great if it's true, but there's a huge difference between somebody putting in a mini split basically for air conditioning and putting in a whole house heat pump that's going to replace their furnace. And I don't know why it's baked into the baseline that penetration is going to be so successful.
That's a great observation, and that's certainly something that could potentially be updated. If Emily is here, Emily, I'll ask you to weigh in on the assumptions around the implementation of heat pumps in the residential sector and how those follow the recent trends that we've seen and how those differ to the assumptions in the other end uses like cooking.
I actually suggest we don't weigh in with more information. Sorry.
Sorry, Emily.
Yeah, Emily, apologies. Yes, take this back. Yes, next week when you come back to us, talk about this, because the fact that there is nothing of a heat pump program in the residential, I think, is disturbing for folks. So we're going to need to end it here because we have a lot of work to do today, and this has been really important. And we need to end it here. So I want to say, Sylvia, the whole team, thank you very much. Thank everyone for your engagement on this. Let's take a 10-minute break, and back at 11:30, I've taken some notes about some of the key things you want to make sure that these folks keep in mind as they keep their work. So I'll include those as our meeting minutes and make sure that Sylvia, you and your team get it as you're finishing up your work this week. All right?
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, and to go to Rich's point, that's an excellent point. And the data, and I just checked with Jane that our team is sharing, we got to revisit cold climate heat pumps and what we think that performance is.
Uh-huh.
So just just put that placeholder there.
Really important to just take 2 seconds to also add, if we're trying to maximize the scale of that investment with the low income folks in Vermont, we need to ensure that we really handle the LIHEAP situation where you're not increasing cost of living in a home as you move towards that sustainable technology. So
Right, because LIHEAP doesn't cover the cost of electricity, it
It's not
covers the
primary.
fuel. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, folks, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11:30. Sylvia, thank you so much, and team. Really appreciate you being here and sharing all that.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
It's supposed to exist, which is not in the budget at all.
Kind of intro funding
All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, folks online as well. We're gonna get going here. So we're gonna dive into intent now. We just did is helpful framing. And obviously next week we'll get a little bit more flavor about, telling at least as about children's targets. But in the meantime, we need to do our own prioritization and our own finalization of actions. So we're gonna break for lunch a little before 1 o'clock. It's about 10 minutes before 1. Between now and lunch, I'd like to do the following. I'd like to spend just a short amount of time on this preamble language, and I'll say a little bit in a second where it came from. Then I want to spend a little bit of time on the education workforce, a new funding piece, the one that David Mears suggested last meeting, in financing, sort of what we used to call our cross-cutting issues. So I want to spend a little time on those, like say a half hour. And then I want to spend a better part, 45 minutes or however much we have on cross-sector, right? So we feel like for lunch, we've gotten into some of the stickiest wickets of our work today. All right, so that's what I'd love to do between now and lunch. We're at this stage where it's really helpful to do gut checks and like say, I'm just not feeling it, something's not working here. The super little nits are hard at this point. We probably can all make this better. But we're moving at a velocity now that's pretty high. So we need to make sure that our gut's letting us move forward. If there's something crucial that would really make this better, stronger, yes, let's spend our time on that. And let's recognize that the classic perfect not being the enemy of the good.
Quick clarifying question. So I should know this, I guess I don't. So I know we have a target number of priority. Are we looking for some kind of relatively even distribution across?
I love how you're saying that. Yeah, so we have not set a clear guideline for yourselves, or you have not set for the council saying, hey, in our top 50-ish, we want to have an equal distribution across our sort of major subject areas. Cross-sector, which is the emissions reduction. We have not said that, but we have tended to that, right? That's where we've gone to. As we do an exercise this afternoon after lunch, when we think about a top 10-ish, right? That could be one thing to put on the table, Chris, to be like, hey, when we hit this top 10, let's not throw all our eggs in this subject. Let's make sure we do even, or maybe you say it differently. It's like, actually, I think we should be more heavily weighted to this area. Those are conversations we can have after lunch when we move more towards a top 10-ish. Right now, they are fairly evenly distributed if you look across. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I've missed this, but so we're gonna hear next week about which of these things we would have to do to hit the targets. But this week, we're prioritizing.
Yeah.
I just,
struggling.
and I'm okay. I'll sit in the discomfort, but I just need to figure out where I am.
Pointing out a very challenging aspect of the timing of all this. The good news is what they're going to run this week in the sort of most cost-effective ways been run in many different iterations in many different places. And someone like Jared and or Julie or other people in the room have seen this story and Rich in many ways, right? So this is not like, I wonder what it's going to say. Like there's a fairly good understanding of what leads to cost-effective on the emissions reductions piece, right? Because that's what the model is giving us. It's not helping us on all the resilience measures or the public health measures or the other stuff, right? On the emissions reductions pieces, that's what's going to help us. And folks in the room have the substantive expertise to say, yeah, when we did it last time, or when these other states have done it, or the general what we know in the world about cost-effective emissions reductions, it still is a lousy situation. We don't have the results of what Sylvia and company are going to do right now. That would be really helpful. We'll get it next week. And I view it more as like a double check of like what we think we know is what the most recent numbers and model tell us. And that what we'll do next week is like, oh yeah, we nailed it. Or wow, we really thought this was going to be great and it's not great. That's what we'll get next week. Make sense? But it's lousy. I agree. Okay. All right. Anything else before we dive in? So first thing I want to do is say a word about this preamble language. If you remember, last time we spoke, and we've been, sweating it back and forth on some of these recommendations. And one of the things we've done is say, we said this last time we met, boy, us to reach agreement on some of these priority recommendations, it's going to be helpful to frame them up with some language. We're calling it preamble language now, but frame it up with some language that gives context to what we're doing. That, some of you have expressed to me, is one of the few ways where you're going to feel comfortable actually with signing off on priority recommendations, if the framing feels right. Okay, so this preamble language comes from some conversations that Julie and Jared and I have had. I put some words on the page, they put some words on the page, they edited words. We've done a little bit of back and forth, but this doesn't represent some great agreement, right? This just represents as far as we've gotten to date. This language will show up in one or more places in the actual document, right? There is a chapter that opens up the priority actions, right? The sort of the introduction to the priority actions. This is very good language for that chapter. It probably will show up in your executive summary, right? It might show up in some other introductory place. It's sort of messages that I think you all want to be transmitting as you're talking about your priority actions. That's what this is all about. And it will show up in a variety of places once you get closer to it. Today, I'd like to give you a moment just to read it. I don't want to go too deep in it. I think if you all can delegate a handful of yourselves, whether it's Jared and Julie, who had the responsibility of writing the priority actions introductory chapter, or you want to add someone to that team, we can finish this up this week and try to make this as very close to as possible of representing all of your views. So let's spend a little bit of time, 5-10 minutes on it today. I think it's helpful grounding for what comes next. So let's do our usual, take a couple minutes, just read it. It's just these bullet points, the first page and a half here. Let's just take a minute, folks online as well. This document is on the webpage calendar thing. Just take a minute and read the bullet point. Again, this is like essential framing for a set of priority actions that are going to come afterwards and then the whole. I'm curious, I like to do this kind of thing just quickly, just to get a sense of where we're at. If this were the guts of this preamble language, how would people feel right now? If you just give me one of these, I'm in there, I'm here, I'm I'm just curious, everybody just put your arm out. How are we doing? We here, there, up? Sideways, a lot of sideways. Okay, some, a little bit of down over here. Okay, a little bit up. All right, I love it. Okay.
What do I know?
And I can't see the folks online, but Ryan and Matt and Leslie Ann is on as well. Just drop something in the chat if you want to. So let's talk quickly about the things that we like about this. Just shout them out quickly. What are some of the messages in here that really are feeling like the right kind of messages? I'm gonna sit and take notes while you guys are talking, by the way. That's why I'm sitting down here. But just a quick shout out. What are some of the things that are a helpful set of introductory messages before you dive into the actual content? The things we like. Let's stick to the things we like.
I think the context is great.
Great. Okay. The context feels right. Okay, nice. What else do we like?
I agree. It captures the moment.
Okay, great. Anything else we're feeling that like is working right now?
Like the overarching criteria.
Okay,
David.
excellent.
I appreciate that it acknowledges the loss of state positions or the threat. I think it's not just the need for more, it's also the threat to current. So the health department, our climate folks are federally funded, and that is at high risk.
Yeah. Yeah. Other things we're liking, yeah, people.
Well, just because it's a crazy time out there, like we're acknowledging that there's a climate crisis and that action is needed. A lot of states going backwards and saying this is not a problem. So still saying it's, we need to move forward. We need to figure out how to do it.
That it makes explicit upfront the need to balance emissions mitigation and resilience and hazard mitigation.
Nice. Other things that are working, yeah, Cal?
That is directs the legislature to find funding sources.
And mentions that we, actually, I think it might mention we actually have recommendations around that. Yeah. Anything else that's like, yeah, let's definitely keep this. We like this. Anything else? Let's talk about the things you'd like to change then.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump back to the previous one and just say that I really appreciate that when evaluating the costs of programs and policies, take into account the costs of not acting. It kind of echoes what you said, but yeah.
Right. Name it. Yep. Okay, what would we change? Rich?
Two things. I agree with what Peter just said, but I don't think it really says that. It doesn't explicitly say that part of the context is that the climate crisis continues and is real. And it should. And secondly, I think we fail to mention what we have in the funding arena. We fail to state the importance of the polluter pays principle, that we've been struggling with this all along, that we can't pay for things by adding to the price of electricity when we want people to electrify. And we should be recognizing the cost of the environmental costs of fossil fuels. So that's not mentioned here at all.
Interesting. Okay. Right. And that could, you're thinking in under sort of the criteria, add a criteria about in how costs are borne and
And I would also add, I think it's implicit in here, but we could be explicit to say that income sensitivity is a high priority with respect to criteria for funding.
and we'll see in the funding thing below, we get into it. We don't do it up with high as much, right? Okay. Other things we'd like to change, Joey.
I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff here. So thank you guys for putting this on the table. Three other thought under the bullet where we talked about the federal government is pulling back. It feels really important to underscore the need for state to step in because the world is moving this way and other states are in solidarity through the U.S. Climate Alliance and otherwise, including California, the fourth largest economy in the world. So I think acknowledging partnership of states and maybe even pointing to Vermont's ongoing participation in the U.S. Climate Alliance. Lastly, too, when we point to legislative action, I think that's really important. I also would say it's a partnership of state governments. I'd love to see legislative action in partnership with executive action as well, just acknowledge the important role of that partnership. And then it's kind of embedded here, but to do what we want to do, which is cost effect, like center equity and the solutions and the benefits, it's needs to be acknowledging that program design, really thoughtful program. To that, like.
Can you say that last part one more time?
Just in terms of the role of like designing different programs, that we want to make sure that when we're developing and deploying programs, take cap and invest, for example, like that can be designed to deliver various outcomes. We want it to deliver, I would like it to deliver balancing cost-effective greenhouse gas emission reductions and mitigating negative financial impacts and driving significant benefits to low to moderate income farmers. So it's just something in there about we achieve these criteria through thoughtful program design.
Got it. Love it. Okay. Other things, yeah, David?
Two things. One, I think the headwinds are more challenging than this captures. That there was a shift in state politics in Vermont. And I think there's less support for the state to step in and play the role that Joey mentions than there was. And so I think there should be a recognition, I don't know the right words to capture that. But, and whether you agree that the state body politic has shifted, the legislature thinks that it's shifted. So the legislative ability and willingness to take on a larger role in the absence of federal funding isn't there. So I think we should capture that, because this seems to lead exactly to what Joey's suggesting. That we're suggesting the state come up with more money. I don't think the state's gonna come up with more money.
I have a if you've captured David's excellent point, I have a corollary.
Yeah.
As someone who was out and then back in, I guess I would say to some degree. And I look to all your faces and see if I see a flicker of recognition. The conversations that I have with people who I would describe as concerned, but not activists or not in the game of doing this kind of stuff is, wait, what's our responsibility? Like, what can Vermont do? And there's nothing here that kind of sets the premise, because what you hear a lot is, and I don't think anyone argues, even the people I talk to don't argue the point about climate change writ large. But what exactly are Vermonters' responsibility and should be paying for to help solve the global problem? What we agree is what portion of this problem are we morally culpable and responsible to solve? Right, and 50,000 people, exactly what are we doing and how can we affect positive change, and why you should be willing to pay an increment more, because it's just something that kind of sets the stage. I mean, is that fair? I mean, that's what Chris, I'm mindful of when you would say, we're gonna risk being, we're just out of touch and not understanding, which is kind of what David is saying. And when I talked, well, no, it's still, I remember Jared saying we downcast, analyze, whatever, we kind of sort of determined, but there's nothing here it goes to the big question writ large, but doesn't talk specifically about, here's the part where we could and we should solve this portion of this global problem.
Which goes to my second point.
Sorry, David.
No, it does. It actually was a great interlude, because what I also feel like this, by being generic about referencing state budgets and the economics, which are a strength of these criteria, what this is worth more conversation, but embedded in this set of recommendations are a number of things that are not, we often think, as a regulator, legal background, I think a lot about, like, how do we set rules that make people do what we want them to do? And how do we raise taxes on people so we can pay for the programs that we need to get done? I feel like neither of those tools are available to us. And so, at least in the near term. So if we're going to use other tools, cap and invest may be a really good one, but there's other ones that create a pull for Vermonters that answer that question, that create a pull, because we want to create a climate workforce. because we want to attract private capital and philanthropic capital and impact investment through using the state's financial capacity to green finance. We want to invest in our working lands economy as essential part of our, building resilience. And we want to, right now, there's this huge interest in building housing. We want to build housing. Well, let's build housing in walkable, livable communities. These are central things to each one of our, policy proposals. Like, let's lift that up. I feel like this is a moment that we have to do that. Sorry, I didn't mean to sound quite so preachy.
So, yeah. Let's take a few more comments and then let's see where we are. And I think you should make a little mini group to come and try to turn these into words on the page. Jay?
So I agree that we should address the current political environment, but it's also is temporary. And I think we should acknowledge that, and that the pendulum will shift eventually, and that, it will. And I don't know, I'm an optimist.
Bless your heart.
It's so Southern. I couldn't be in this world. But, we're creating a bold plan that, we're gonna plow ahead regardless of what's going on with this bold inspirational plan that is really considering the future for the next 25 years. So I don't know, it's like, so we might not have the funding now, but we will hopefully have it in 4 years, 5 years.
Right. So in the way we write about headwinds, don't make it sound like it's forever, right? If
Yes.
we don't know what the future is, it may be.
Maybe it will be worse. I don't know if we're going off Chris.
We'll get the second punch or not.
My chuckle was not at you. That was an exasperation. That was just. Not at you.
Kelly, and then let's take one or two more comments and then let's just make a plan for the edits.
Yeah, what Carrick said about when you talk to people, what I hear when I talk to people who aren't, the people who came to our public meetings, the people who are in this room, what I hear from other folks who are still concerned, farmers, people in our local community who I talk to at the farmer's market, they're worried about food security. They're worried about, finding housing for their employees or being able to recruit workforce because there's nowhere for them to live. Those sorts of things. And those are all tangential, like what David was saying. Let's build houses. That's going to help with a lot of things. And if we build them in the right way and they're, low energy use houses in a walkable, there's so many things that we can be doing that are a little bit more, that will resonate more with our day-to-day Vermonters than we need to be the climate champions and we're going to be the world leaders in reducing emissions. Like, what's in it for me as a regular person who's just trying to hold down a job? So I think that's where we could potentially just shift the tone of this a little bit. And then to that, the one thing that I had noted that was a little bit more specific is in the criteria thing, it says, make certain there are enough trained workers in the state. And I'm like, how? And so I think we need to be more specific there, or more flush that out a little bit more. And then to that same point, in the following bullet, ensure necessary supporting investments are being funded. I think we need to add workforce training as one of those things in that list, because that's going to take some funding. And that's, again, going to resonate more with people than necessarily funding, electric panel upgrades. And one tiny little thing, I think it shouldn't be IE there. It should be EG. Your examples, not in other words. This is the full list.
Right.
Anything.
Chris, let's just, because we could go forever. I just want to mention that, but let's take a few more comments and then let's get into the meat of our priority, Chris.
I would love to start out with it's a very clear statement, we're trying to strike the balance between further reducing our 0.1% contribution to US emissions while also, reinforcing development patterns that provide housing for Vermonters in places that are going to be, I would just call out frankly, flood and other climate, I think we can talk about climate broadly, and I know heat is actually the bigger killer than floods. There are a lot of other things, but floods are what obliterate homes, right? So anyway, I'm happy to help craft that. The other thing, if we keep with this first bullet, let's just call out, say, as well as support adaptation, resilience, and disaster recovery. Just be explicit about those things. On the fourth bullet, okay, we're talking about federal funding, Vermonters, wearing my municipal hat, I would say reduce federal funding coupled with fiscal capacity of Vermonters and their municipalities. Because as the federal government is moving towards shifting everything to the state, I guarantee you the state is gonna start shifting more cost to municipalities. So I think we have to call that out. And I seldom hear have I talked about dying on a sword, but that is one to me, we just need to call out because because that level of taxation that just never seems to be recognized. And I'm really thinking about this in the context of if we're gonna have fewer federal contributions to disaster recovery, how in the hell are towns gonna pay for all these blown out culverts and road segments and town offices? And then lastly, in the first bullet on the second page, again, where it says ensure state budgets include yada yada, to underwrite agency positions. Somewhere out there, I think we need to also talk about and municipal responsibilities, because again, municipal budgets need to be taken into account here too. It can't just be assumed that, oh, the towns will just magically come up with whatever it is.
Okay. Great. Eric, Joey, or by the way.
I guess, I mean, I think these are some great comments and to whomever is lucky enough to dig into this further. I guess to your point, which I very much appreciate, no one wants to be tone deaf. I think we are all very much grappling with and recognizing the new reality. And at the same time, I would just encourage us to guard against political analysis. Like the Global Warming Solutions Act is the law, the legislature considered it. And we need a plan that reflects the moment of these very challenging times while also continuing to lean in to the mitigation strategies in particular that move Vermonters off of fossil fuel that we import can be a very significant benefit. I just want to guard against us being political analysts.
Fair. Yep.
Just read this quickly, so there may not be a specific spot, but mindful of creating that pull energy. Shame on me for not sharing this before, but where Vermont has been able and has a rich history of innovation and energy doing stuff that helps. It is by, especially now in this place, in this time, is leveraging the regulatory structure and geography and composition that we have. Because we have like a leader in the investor-owned utilities in Green Mountain Power. We have a leader, these are national leaders in the form of Vermont Electric Co-op, and nationally in terms of for municipalities and Burlington Electric. BIPSA is coming on. There's things we can do that attract philanthropic and other type of cattle because we can accomplish it here. So something that speaks to there are inherent strengths that we can leverage to mitigate some of the incredible obstacles that we have, and we have a record of that. So something that at least gives voice to that optimistic
Optimism.
thing. Yeah.
So
Great.
if I might, we
Yep.
might be small and worry about what our impact can be globally, but we are nimble because we are small. And that,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Sorry, just taking.
No,
Okay.
love and affection.
Who's gonna work with Julie and Jared to help on this? Chris, you had mentioned that you'd be willing to be part of that. It involves.
Yeah, being I'm on vacation next week.
I took very close notes of what you said.
Yeah, I've got good notes. And yeah, Julie, you're out like starting Friday. So I would love if there's a chance to hop on a quick call. I mean, I'll share around the notes sometime this week, maybe in a Wednesday kind of situation, Tuesday, Wednesday. I think that's the ideal thing.
Help.
You'll help? Awesome. Okay, so folks, I'm just gonna note down Jared, Julie, Sheila, and Chris. And let's try to get on just even if it's a half hour day, I'll share on the notes ahead of time so we can think about what. Okay, sound good?
Will there be an opportunity to dig into the cross-sector mitigation strategies, or should I make this that opportunity?
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely will. Okay, speaking of that, let us start digging in. Thank you all for that good feedback. I think we're gonna make that preamble much stronger. I want to start on the education workforce funding and finance part. So that's, I didn't number these pages, so yeah.
We can count.
That's right. It's only a few pages in. It's after the cross sector. It's the first thing after the cross sector. It starts with education workforce. Okay. So, what I'm gonna do, what I'd love to do in the, just take a few moments to walk through this of what changed, right? So let me show my version on the screen of, the track change versions of what's gone on. And let's see if we can do this relatively efficiently. And if Leslie Ann is still on, that would be a joy. Oh, great. Leslie Ann, you still are here. This would be a great time if you're able to help out here. Let me share my screen. Okay. We did very, very modest changes since our last meeting. Remember what we spoke about in our last meeting where we had in our second education workforce recommendation, this word create that was causing a little bit of consternation because there's actually a lot of good interdisciplinary climate change curriculum out there. So I just went and proactively changed the compile. So trying to channel Leslie Ann, but I didn't get a chance to check in with her. So Leslie Ann, if you're here and weigh in on this, this felt like a way to address what we heard the other day about concerns about that one. So that's one thing. And let me pause. And if Leslie Ann's in a place where she can talk, I know she's a little on the move today. So that was addressing the concern that happened there. The other thing we did is just add a little bit more clarity where folks wanted more clarity about what these, like what kind of careers we're talking about here. We added in the word conservation and also other types of careers. I put in a shout out to planners. So that happened to give the clarity based on your last meeting. Now, the thing what I didn't get anybody's input on was there was a comment in our last meeting about the impacts of on workforce. Say workforce is currently in the fossil sector, whether it's oil fleets or things like that. Trying to track the impacts on that and create programs to support them. And we were like, well, what are the leading indicators? I don't know. So if somebody has an idea about what leading indicators to put in terms of tracking the impact on workforce of our energy switching and decarbonization, let me know. I feel like this is not mission critical. We could just end the sentence here, but if someone wants to add something in there, that's fine. You can do that right now or later. Okay, so this is what we did on our education and workforce stuff. Just change that one word on number 2 and then throw in the additional detail folks asked for. And then I just have this pending thing about what would be a leading indicator in terms of looking at workforce and the impact of decarbonization on our work. Any quick thoughts on this before we jump to the funding and financing? Look good? Thumbs up? Yeah, thumbs up? Great. If anybody has ideas here, great. We'll add them in. We can add them in this week. If not, I'm just put a period here and know that it's up to those who take this plan to go figure out what those indicators are.
Just a quick note on that bullet point. You called out weatherization up above. This would be a good opportunity to put that in as well. Training, support, and service learning systems.
Great. Which bullet are you talking about here?
3, it could be someplace in that string.
Right. Conservation, whether it's clean energy, weatherization, that kind of thing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure, planners and engineers is really the right
Okay.
career types of careers, but
Well, all ears.
I mean, as an engineer, I always like to see it called out, but I would delete that phrase, honestly.
Great. Okay.
Wait, why?
What is a good resilience career? What would be the right answer?
Try to do what we're trying to do without planners and try to do it without engineers, honest to God.
I don't think it matches the list, Chris. Farm and forestry, conservation, clean energy, outdoor recreation, and resilience.
I think we're trying to define resilience careers. is what we-
Yeah. The engineers to help that housing that's gonna be resilient.
I mean, this is the level of detail.
Can
you hear me, David?
This is the level of detail, I think, if people feel strongly about it, this is not gonna make or break us. I think if this is helpful for someone to see that in there, let's leave it in there.
Oh, yeah, because you're not gonna become a plant. Yeah, through service learn. Yeah, that's true. Sorry.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Number 4, first bullet, increase the number of registered apprenticeships that can be supported. Is that in there because it's been determined that there are not enough slots for those programs?
Yeah, waiting lists and.
Okay,
And yeah.
Yep,
Like
okay.
currently,
Okay.
even for what we're doing right now, not enough slots.
Okay.
Much less
Good to know.
increased action.
Leslie has her hand up.
Leslie Ann, jump on in.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So, on that bullet point there, just before we come back up to the one that I know you had called out my name for earlier, if you want to add adaptation, so resilience and adaptation careers, that might expand that suite and give folks that breadth that you're looking for without specifically calling out planners or engineers and then leaving out other folks. So that might be one tweak in there. Service learning is a programming, it's a teaching pedagogy, and so slightly uncomfortable with the word systems, but we could leave it for now until we find something a little bit more appropriate in terms of an educational program. And I'm fine with the word compile in number 2.
Great, thanks.
A quick plug on the following
Problem.
bullet. For the language to
Pardon?
reflect. Oh, sorry.
We're just, Will's jumping in here, Leslie Ann, thank you.
Okay.
Didn't mean to impede. Good points, Leslie. Sorry about that. Just to plug to reflect the language you listed in that third bullet point in that fourth one. If we're talking about expansion to include more resilience and climate focused nodes, we could also call that out in the next bullet point there to reflect some of those same things we listed in the previous one.
Okay,
Obviously including weatherization, but the rest of them too.
okay. Does that make sense to everybody? You're saying in this in this thing, double up on some of the things that we talked about up here?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just make a note to that effect, all right?
But apologies to Julie for my outburst. I'm wondering, would it be,
That was an outburst.
No.
All family.
would it be possible, would it be, can you go back to the line? Sorry, I'll wait till you go. Take your time.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, so go, in that first paragraph where it talks about support new and existing workers and assured job. Can we say retain university graduates?
Okay, I feel like it's a different thing, but that's important to somebody, to you?
Oh, it'd be nice to
No, I,
keep
the people that are
graduating
getting.
out of all that, yeah.
Keep them in Vermont.
Yeah, it'd be great to educate them, have them stay as opposed to go.
Okay, we'll add it in. Great.
Don't have to.
Retain recent graduates or.
It would give us reason to think about an incentive to keep them there, adding an incentive to keep them here.
Okay, great. All right, can we bump forward? This sounds good. Any last things before we move on? It's a dangerous thing for me to have this doing real-time edits. That is like,
Put a comma
I
after
think so.
weatherization above the list of weatherization, outdoor recreation.
thank you.
So we don't come back and go like, what's weatherization outdoor?
Nice.
I like that.
I mean, I wouldn't mind branching out. I mean, outdoor rec enthusiasts could be a lot more interesting.
Maybe that's catapult us to number 1, an outdoor rec.
All right, funding and financing. Here we go. So this is where you see some new things here. Change. This is something David Mears brought up in our last meeting. David sent some potential text over. I happened to be on the phone with Jared and Julie at the same time, and we did a little version of it here. This is about encouraging the legislature to go forth and find some funding sources now. So you can read what it says. Identify revenue sources, either new or existing, that can immediately start to fund key climate action plan recommendations, such as weatherization, resilience strategies, et cetera. Use the model of funding for clean water when identifying these sources. The source of revenue should, and then there's these 3 things. A, sunset upon the adoption of the Cap and Invest program. B, be structured to mitigate impacts on Vermonters facing financial hardships. C, support a transition across a less, support a transition towards less carbon intensive fuels. I.e. the revenue source should not involve taxing renewable energy or electric vehicles. I think this gets a little bit to what Rich was saying as well, of the way you raise money makes a difference. So that's what we have in here. This is the first time you're looking at it and seeing it. We just mentioned it verbally last time. So I want to just have a quick pause to say, does this reflect what we spoke about in the meeting last time? Are there better things to do or different ways of expressing this one? Yeah, David.
Just a friend, more of a question, frankly, but a suggested friendly amendment. Rather than talk about key climate action plan recommendations, which is somewhat generic, I was leaning more towards stuff that we knew that was, we talked about low hanging fruit. In my mind, low hanging fruit is, it's a proven program that exists and that it's cost effective to implement. And so weatherization to me, like, jumps off the charts as like an example of that. Some other things that might fit, I think others may have better, more informed thoughts, but I was looking at, investment in our working lands enterprise fund, investment in existing workforce training programs that are tied to climate change. And some of this may be a new one, but it was number 15 and the resilience provisions about funding for resilience equipment, supplies and services. But those were all things that seemed like they were so directly benefiting communities, and they were existing programs. So it's like it feels like they could really attract funding more easily. But whatever they were, whatever we agreed that they were, those are the examples of thing like that, and not leave it too vague and open-ended.
Okay, so that requires us to do a little process amongst ourselves in deciding what we want to put in there. Right? And I think there's a question mark in my mind, how much you want to be naming that stuff versus how much you want to be saying, get the funding and focus the funding on proven strategies. And then, so I think you can do it either way. Yeah, Joey?
My thought on that, considering for what we went through this morning with the business as usual, like, I feel like maybe not naming specific things in this moment, just to say, or something like to fund key climate action plan, mitigation, adaptation, resilience strategies. I just worry about calling out a couple of things, and I don't know if we have the time to get into what makes that list at this moment. So I guess I would just keep it a little bit more generic.
Are you, David, would it be fair to say you're worried about like existing versus generating something new? Because you're looking at the immediate, right? Is that,
I'm trying to think
so
about.
do you say like to start to fund or improve funding or increase funding for existing key climate change, like, so that it's not about startup? Is that where does that get at it?
Yeah, stuff that I'm just trying to think of things that will the legislature, there won't be a lot of blowback. Like things, there's not gonna be a lot of headwinds to keep it.
Your point is well taken with regards to the direct correlation between clarity of return on investment and ability to get to yes. This is, okay, we've all known about this need. For this much dollars, there's a fair extrapolation that we'll get this much more value. The clearer that is, the more likely we'll get to yes on any of this happening. Take that as you will.
Joey, getting back to your
I
point,
just
right?
wanna-
Yeah.
So I appreciate what you're offering, and I also wonder, like, the Mileage Smart is not an existing program anymore because we shuttered it. So I guess I just feel like we should be a little bit more broad in this one. I take your point and I very much appreciate it, but I just worry about, then we carve out some that we might.
Oh, yeah.
So what if we, this part of this gets rewritten, with some language that's really about criteria, right? And it's about, to fund programs, that are proven cost-effective ways to reduce emissions and be more resilient and adapt, right? Something like that. Like you could do criteria like that, and then we get out of the business right now of saying politically what's going to be the easiest lift, right? Liz?
Support that. The question is, just understanding the clean water tree and the fund, all of that personally. What do we mean by use the model of clean water fund? What's that sentence mean and why is it there?
I assumed it was the all-in approach.
And do we need it, given the rest of what it says underneath? So anyway.
I mean, I think, Julie, do you want to respond to that? Because I know that you've been helpful in laying out what.
Yeah, I mean, in part, and David can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the idea of a bridge to a longer solution.
Which is the next sentence. So I'm wondering if we really need it. because It feels like to an outside audience, if it's shorthand for us, we may want to make it longer hand if we keep it in. It's just shorthand for us in order to understand the next sentence. I suggest we could take it out.
Sense.
Okay.
Yeah, and it can start immediately and serve as a bridge to fund, right? Like you could add that to the first sentence, but the idea is a cap and invest or any big comprehensive programs, obviously gonna take years to put into place and should do nothing in the
I support
interim.
that. I wasn't sure if there was something more meant by that. If that's what you mean, that's great. And I would suggest we say that.
I don't want to interpret David's
no, that's
words.
exactly-
Okay.
So I'm taking, what the things I'm doing here, I'm saying, for instance, for that sentence of, referencing the clean water, take it out and add the attributes into the other sentences. So we're just being clear. The piece where we're naming the different kinds of things, we're talking about key recommendations, change that to talk about the criteria that we think this is appropriate for, right? Criteria such as, easily implemented, cost effective, We'll figure out the right words on that. Okay.
Alternate.
Bill? Yeah.
With the greatest respect, and I really appreciate the point from Joey and others. I'm sure folks are tracking the headlines and reading news updates and things like that. So this weekend, I got one that talked about the most recent budget drop from the big beautiful bill and some of the details in that analysis. And if you look at the page in the Department of Energy related to all the things we've talked about so far, the proposed investment is zero across the board in all of those types of things, including weatherization. So on the one hand, being generic makes sense to me, but on the other hand, specifically calling out the things we know have a really good return on investment that are totally imperiled also makes sense to me. So just presenting that as a potential thing for us to consider, that it might not be bad to specifically talk about a series of things that we see a lot of value in, that we anticipate there will be no short-term funding source for.
Okay.
But that could be a longer list. I'm not saying that just has to be weatherization. I think there's 5 or 6 great things there to include.
Following up on Will's point, I think one of the bullets, one of the criteria can be reflecting immediate loss of federal funding. Just state that generally. And and I'm in agreement with the folks who say that if we start to make a list and I think it's kind of a sinkhole for us. I think we should do criteria, but I agree with the one you just brought up. And I have one modification to suggest.
Okay.
Sunset upon the adoption of cap and invest. It's too blunt. We don't know if there's going to be adequate revenue from a cap and invest scheme. We don't know that what that will look like. I would say something like sunset when adequate revenue is available
Or use your bridge language there.
upon implementation of.
Bridge toward or bridge to.
Right. A bridge to adequate revenue coming from other programs such as cap and invest, something like that.
I'm totally in favor of this idea that we have to start doing this, and we hope that, older things will happen. But in the meantime, we should continue to build our set of stairs.
Great. I just made that quick change in here. It's dangerous for you to watch me write like this. Okay, thanks, Rich. Yeah, Chris?
At the end of 7 in the prints, immediately my mind goes to revenue source should not involve taxing renewable energy. So I'm thinking immediately municipal grand list, taxation of renewable energy, which we're saying don't do that.
But new Texas on.
Well, and then the other is on the electric vehicles. Again, may I'm misreading this or misunderstanding, but then how, as we transition to EVs, how are we paying for transportation infrastructure and the federal match. So I would say until we have a better, when we were calling out, I don't know, it just doesn't seem resolved.
Right, I feel like the
I get
intent
where-
behind here is not create disincentives for the very actions we're promoting, right? That's the intent, right?
If you really want to create a disincentive for municipalities to support renewable energy, tell them they can't tax it,
Okay.
right? I mean,
Should, on a next, this is the kind of thing where I'd love to sort of agree now on something, if not the precise wording, the general guts of that, but the essential is, I think what's, David, what you're trying in the original way you wrote it was, should not create disincentives to the very programs that will be our climate solutions, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe that's not like a prohibition on taxing something, but it's just like, let's be thoughtful about.
yeah, and I was just reading if the general public read what was there,
Maybe that's another place, we've got the criteria in there and we don't need the examples.
Yeah, we have taxed the bad and not the good for a short term. Eventually we can start in the good.
Okay. All right, folks, last bits on this? Yep.
Recognizing that this is intended to be a bridge, the source of revenue should, I mean, you could just say could, because if it's something that's working, I guess I don't. Again, to Rich's point, does it cap and get us all the way there? No, maybe this would be your face.
Oh, you wish.
I feel like it could, and then it's like above my pay grade, our pay grade to determine if it should or not.
I think part of it is just one of the lessons from clean water was easier to get to yes with describing it as something that was going to sunset. And to the extent it becomes permanent, it removes any incentive for people to talk about it. Solved and they walk away.
That's not where I'm coming from.
No, it's like, I think the idea of a sunset, and again, David, correct me if I'm wrong, is it puts a sense of urgency on getting to the actual solution.
Yeah.
And if you don't sunset it, there is no urgency.
All right, folks, so the notes that we've taken here is we're gonna fix this little phrase here to talk more about the criteria for use that we've talked about. And we're not gonna mention specific things for now, and probably not in the future, we'll see. We're gonna take out this sentence about use the model for clean water, but the attributes of that we will put into the other sentences, and we'll work with Julie and others to get those attributes in correctly. And David. And then we're gonna take out this specific mention of these revenue sources and actually speak to the criteria again. The revenue source should not be a disincentive to the very programs we're trying to promote. Okay, so that's what I've got here. And we also, I just made this change as well about should be a bridge to having adequate revenue from other programs such as the capital. Okay, that's what we did on that. Great.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I missed most of this discussion, and I agree with, I think, the intent and the direction that's in this action, but I just bringing that overall affordability lens. So I think that's my role as Secretary of Administration. And so as we move forward in this conversation, understanding that there's trade-off and policy choices as we identify either a new revenue source or diverting an existing revenue source. But why I like the clean water example, because I think it provides a really solid example of how like that activity really worked and solved several problems. And so, but I just say affordability.
Right, right. Okay. The next piece here is another newish one. We talked about it in the last meeting we had. Joey brought it up and brought it up a couple times. And I just tried what it feels like to throw this in the document. And so it's under the funding and financing bucket of recommendations is implement the Climate Superfund Act, including by funding the work of ANR and the Treasurer's Office, and any work deemed necessary to support its implementation. Right? And the reason it's here is as helping to provide essential revenue to invest in resilience and adaptation.
Should that be the work of the state? Doesn't the AG, when they need to hire consultants and other? Does it say Attorney General?
How about if I just say any other work deemed necessary?
Attorney General.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this was speaking to, Chris, is the feasibility study that we submitted with the treasurer's
Okay.
office that only got a fraction of the funding we said was necessary to fulfill it. The Attorney General, I believe, has testified that she has all the resources she needs to
Okay.
fulfill challenges.
My head was immediately going to the Vermont Yankee dockets and Wilmer Hale sitting there to do battle for the state against Entergy. So I don't know if like the AG was gonna have to, you know, if that was, okay. If y'all are comfortable.
Yes, I mean, they're gonna need help, I suspect, but her position, I understand to be that she has what she needs.
I trust y'all's, however you want.
Any, thanks, Chris. Any concerns, including this in our list of priority recommendations?
I don't, I wasn't around when it was enacted, so other people have a better history, I guess, in this. It feels like, okay, we're gonna take a swing, right? This is like, take a swing. And if it comes in with money, great. But I have no idea how realistic it is that we're actually gonna get anything. It's gonna take resources and we'll see.
It's 10 years from now. Right, like this is long-term. I guess I would worry it creates false hope.
Number 8 in general, you mean?
Yeah.
So what's I don't know.
I put it forward
Okay.
in part because it is a policy of the state of Vermont and it is a potential revenue source. And it also speaks to the polluter pays principle, like the being to, we all have a responsibility, even if our micro drop in the global bucket, including the fossil fuel industry, which is what the state of Vermont has said. So is it a long shot? Yes. Is it a harder long shot if we don't acknowledge the importance of it? I would argue yes. So I think pointing directionally.
So you actually think that this helps bolster in some way, shape, manner, or form, bolsters the argument and our chances of success by enumerating it?
I don't think it hurts. I mean, it's the state.
Okay.
Like is it potentially a long shot, but is it a potential revenue source instead of just communities in the state of Vermont holding the bag?
Okay, I'll defer to others. This is nothing I'm sweaty about.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm not
Great.
sweaty about it either, but I'm just.
I mean, it's part of a package of things in this funding and financing where there's this more immediate, more practical, like, this is in your purview, legislature and others, you can do this. This is more like, big swing at the future. Let's see. And then we have this, which is more like get creative in different ways to think about financing.
I think what I keep getting hung up on is the implementation of this is fairly straightforward. It's the litigation that is the challenge and it is silent on the fact that.
Does Joey, did you mean word implement at the front?
I
with
didn't
regard to the
write this.
final?
Bless David for
Okay.
penning
I
this.
had the same question, like, is it really implement or is it utilize when available, or is it keep in mind long-term could include? or-
Like utilize when available.
I mean, I just didn't know what you meant. Is there something that's supposed to happen now?
Utilize the Climate Super Fund Act.
I mean, I guess what I was recommending, I appreciate that you put it under funding and financing, but it's not only about that. It is, so utilize when available.
Well, no, was there something that needs to happen right this minute other than eventual success in the litigation?
NAR says they need more money to do
Yeah.
this stuff.
Actual work, yeah. Before.
So both of these things are office.
I read it as tying to the preamble, and I'm sorry I missed that discussion where we're, confirming that we need to add, if we're gonna do these actions, we need to adequately resource the agencies and departments. That's how I read that, if it meant more, like, if it was broader than that.
I think it is both, but we ultimately, the Attorney General, I mean, I think plays the role. So I didn't put it here, so I appreciate it.
Maybe that is,
But-
that's the phrase though, Sarah, adequately resource the implementation of the Climate Superfund Act, including the work by ANR, Treasurer and others to support.
Support successful implementation of the Climate Super Fund, including by funding, so that it does not say that it is all encompassing in terms of resourcing it.
Yeah.
That works. Thanks for taking a stab, David. Not-
Always happy to be the punching bag.
It's still light.
Okay. So the final thing in here is this one, which we haven't changed in a long time, but it's more of a financing piece of getting creative about leverage, different kinds of capital. So that hasn't changed any of our.
The PUC in there, I'm just curious. I don't,
Sure about the sub bullet necessarily at all. Like stakeholders in exploring opportunities.
it felt like one of those is not very much not like the other. But maybe it's a lack of understanding on my part too.
To me, that the sub-bullet really isn't needed.
Great.
Yeah. Any time to get rid of work.
Okay.
Can I ask why climate infrastructure financing?
Including on-bill
towards their
utility
capital?
financing, because it is not, despite everybody, including myself, wishing otherwise, it has not proven successful after different ways of trying it. So it just feels like it's false billing.
This one.
Unintended. Yep.
that-
Just so you all know, that was one of the strikeouts they asked for. And the reason, the utilities, they sent us a letter. I'm aware of it because I'm the utility representative, but they sent a letter on behalf of the utilities asking for that change because they felt like it, the way it's listed, it does say potentially. They have not found it to be. It's been a lot of work and not a lot of benefit. Years.
And Liz, just clarity, is that largely the RAP program?
It's not just the RAP program. I mean, there's been, I don't know, 4 or 5 different versions. RAP is the most recent. Where we have as the largest utility in the state, something like 8 people. I mean, it's with hours and hours and hours and hours. of information. Yeah. So anyway,
I mean, as the one who wrote this recommendation, I don't feel like super strongly. I guess I meant to be like, this is a list of examples and I don't think banging our head up against the wall, but I do think as we move to electrify, leaning into the infrastructure that we have at utilities to, I don't know. I think about the property assessed clean energy program had potential and then
Also
we
didn't go
structured that program
Yeah.
because of the way that I think the ultimate legislation structure.
Okay.
So I don't feel strongly about it, but it meant to be an example, not a directive.
I am at your mercy. Don't tell me what to do, but I'm happy to take this out. How about this?
I'll speak to it. I support leaving it in. I think there are variations on-bill finance that we haven't tried. And I think that financing is a barrier to electrification. And we need to find ways to help customers, including in landlord-tenant situations, who move building, and on-bill financing could be designed differently. Make that possible.
Okay. Well, how about this? Let's leave it in for now. And then if we want to have some sort of creative moment on this week, I'd feel free to grab Rich and you, Liz and Joey, and see if we can do, if there's any way of saying that would reflect the history we've had so far.
Just to be clear, I'm going to, I don't know where my team is on this, so I'm gonna explore that as well.
Great. Helpful. So folks, yeah.
Real quick, I also think that so long as our examples are relevant, it's helpful for the public. If they're reading this and they're like, what other useful strategies might there be? So if they're not completely off the mark and completely impossible, then I think leaving them in is helpful for anyone who's maybe reading this and not a deep expert.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah. All right, folks. I think we did it in terms of getting through those education workforce, funding, financing, cross-cutting pieces. I think before we go to lunch, which we're going to do in about 12 minutes, I want to just poke our nose into cross-sector. And that way, when we go to lunch, we have some things that we can think about for a little bit. Let me tell you what's happened in cross-sector. And honestly, not a ton. I got to admit, not much has gone on. The bigger effort was doing preamble. Yeah,
I thought we were not prioritizing.
not yet. This afternoon.
Got it.
This
I
afternoon.
thought we were going sections and talking.
No. We're going to look across all the sections. And we will have some discussion ahead of that. So if there's things you want to say and make people know. Okay, what's happened in the cross sector? Not a ton, right? A few nips and tucks based on your last conversation, like a word changed here, putting in the word expeditiously here and changing this to a will. And sort of like trying to get Rich's point last time was like, let's get ANR committed to working expeditiously to put a reporting framework in place. And recommend statutory changes and funding needed to support streamline reporting. Okay, so that's what's happened at the top here. Try to get at that kind of conversation. Here, there was a pretty significant rewrite of this sort of final note. And the final note is needed because we've wrapped and rolled into this cap and invest recommendations, some of the other sort of big picture recommendations on cross-sector emissions, particularly in the thermal sector. And there was some discussion about like, are we picking cap and invest over the others or what's happening here? And that's what this new language tries to do. So if you just take a moment and read this, I'm not going to read it aloud because to me, take a moment and read this if you don't mind. And this is sort of where our latest and greatest language is at the bottom of this cap and invest.
Is there a word missing will be
Maybe.
needed to target reductions in the third line?
Don't know.
Okay.
Will be needed to create reductions or
Yeah.
it feels like target might be the wrong word.
Achieve.
Achieve.
Achieves in the next.
Is there a reason you would use target?
Yeah, while the word target suggests that the complementary programs can be designed to ensure that, let's say, benefits are delivered in rural areas.
Oh, I see.
Or benefits are delivered in multifamily housing.
Not clear with how that's written for some.
How about that? To achieve targeted reductions, deliver benefits.
We do that with energy efficiency programs, for example.
Yeah. Thanks, Rich. Will?
I know so far I've pretty much tried to increase the amount of times the weatherization included in this document, but I wanted to share some context and take just a moment here. Like Secretary Clark's statement earlier, I really am trying to represent affordability for Vermonters within the community action agency sector here. And there's a few places in here where we're aspirational, but I'd really like to buy a shall. Having spent a lot of years as a contractor and an executive director implementing contracts, should is nice, but shall really gets you there. Maybe you should paint my house, but if you shall, then I shall pay you the money, not I should pay you the money. So on this first bullet point, we talk about how we should use some of these funds to provide direct payments or rebates. I personally would love to see that turn into a significant portion of cap and invest revenues shall be used to provide direct payments or rebates. And as close to real time as possible to Vermonters with low and middle incomes. And we should talk about how the cost of living does not increase as a result of the cap and invest program, I believe. So we can add that to the end of that first sentence. So by simply saying a significant portion of cap and invest revenues shall, yada, yada, and middle incomes cost of living does not increase as a result of the cap and invest program. That's one recommendation. And then down below, in the end of that treaties on the cap and invest program, the very last sentence that starts, this cap also includes, I think that's another place where we could say, so long as this does not result in an increase to the cost of living for low and moderate income Vermonters. These are places where I think we really want to be explicit that what we're talking about is not going to be on the backs of folks that are really struggling. I know that's polarizing and specific language is difficult, but I wanted to be sure to say all that.
Can you tell me one more time the second place you were suggesting the cost of living language?
Right between fuel standards and this cap. You go to the very.
Oh, right here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right there. So I've, there's a tricky thing with the word shall.
Yes.
In that this, should not, right? Not.
So long as this does not result in an increase to the cost of living for low and moderate income Vermonters. And just a little bit of context, we did a lot of sessions for Vermonters We Serve to better understand the clean heat standard and give some perspective on how they felt about it. And one of the biggest impediments to widespread support was just a lack of clarity about how it might impact their own personal finances. And I think this is an opportunity where it could just be totally specific and explicit that that's not what we're doing.
Yeah. So on the shall and the shoulds, which is we'll face throughout this document probably, right? One of the things is, as the Climate Council, you have a role to play. You make recommendations to the legislature, to the administration, and you have one more binding power, which is you can force the Agency of National Resources in some circumstances to enact rulemaking. When you make a recommendation like this, which is saying to the legislature, go do this, you actually can't shall. You know what I mean? It's at least the way I read the things. Others may see it differently. It feels awkward for you as a council to be like, you shall do this, because you actually don't have the power to say that. I think if you feel very, very strongly about it, we can say, we feel very, very, very strongly about this. I'm nervous about putting words like shall throughout this document, where we don't have the actual, legal or.
I appreciate that. And I guess I would say I had to try.
Yeah, fair.
And then I would also say something like modified to every effort will be made to, or something that's very highly suggestive of a strong intent would be acceptable if that's possible. Yeah, great in that way.
To put shall in our plans and get ignored all the time.
Reality. On the books for 20 years.
Okay, so may I just ask this? So this final note about the cap and invest as the overarching policy. Is that something that you have concurrence here as a council, or is this being proposed as?
We are working our way towards that concurrence, and we've been iterating on this the last several meetings. And one of the things that's been happening is, in providing more clarity about the message to the legislature felt positive to a large number of folks here. That the message is clear as opposed to, here's 5 things that are important, right? This is like, hey, folks, this is a pathway. This is what I'm hearing from you all as council. Like, we want to lift this up. We have this final note to say complementary stuff is going to be needed in different times in different ways and to target different things. But there is an intent here by collapsing some of these other things into cap and invest, lifting up cap and invest as a pathway worth pursuing.
Can I just add to that? Did you want to say something more?
No, go ahead, please.
I think that something that was said, I think it was the last meeting by Rich, was that the way he put it was that, or maybe, I don't know, that this was the leading strategy, and that before that could be fully implemented, there'd be the staircase, that there would be other measures that we should have in place. And that really made sense to me as a newcomer, that it wasn't just this is it and that's all people hear. But if they see it in context with a strategy, a larger strategy, a little more complex strategy, it's, to me, it's more, I don't know what the word is, reassuring or comprehensible.
Yes, and I would think, Rich, you would add, even when you have a cap and invest coming in, you may want other types of policies to do other types of things as well.
And you also said that no other place is just doing cap and invest, as I recall. That this is, so looking at how it's done elsewhere, it is not done by itself as a sole.
Yeah, I would add to that, even we're not doing, even where we have cap and invest in the power sector, we're not relying on cap and invest alone. Delivered change in the power sector. We have efficiency programs, we have renewables. We have a bunch of other programs that operate alongside Reggie. So even we have that experience.
Kelly, and then I feel like you're still breathing through that. So Kelly, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the words primary overarching are not quite right. Maybe that's what Carrick was sort of going for. Integral? I mean, I don't know, like it's one of the key pieces, like a keystone policy, not to say that it's the only one we should be paying attention to or, so I'm not sure what words, but I do see it as being really central to all these other things. And there are co-benefits from a cap and invest that are not just for emissions reduction. Like it will have co-benefits that can help us with, resilience and, the weatherization isn't just for emissions reduction either. It's for us to be more resilient and adapt to a changing climate. So it just feels like it's this, I don't know, keystone, central, I don't know what else.
How do we get that word right and that qualification right?
Keystone's a good word.
Sarah, you were gonna say something?
My only, as I read number one, not the final note, and the language does get there eventually, but it talks about joining a cap and invest program. And it gives the two examples, right? But I reread the treasurer's report this morning, understanding that recommendation, like right now, there is not a viable cap and invest program for Vermont to join right now. And so, and I think this narrative says necessary steps. So in that first, under number one, the bolded part. So it does lay out, like, we can't join until these steps occur, but I'm not sure if it can be more explicit when it talks about, like, I don't know if it's as viable, join a cap and invest program, whatever the right words are. I'm just concerned that it initially leads us to think that's what we should be doing right now. But as I understand it, and I am not a climate expert, I look around the table at folks that know a lot more, but that's kind of my takeaway from that section.
Yeah, and we've gone back and forth and back on this particular language, right? And we've landed in this place, for now, at least, with trying to give a clarity of message that joining cap and invest program is something that this council is recommending. And there are next steps that need to happen prior to that being even possible. And so that's that second sentence in there. However, if it's not working, then let's fix that. I want to circle back quickly to this question here. If folks feel like Keystone or something like that feels like the better description, let's do that, right?
I don't necessarily want to wordsmith, but I guess the thing with a cap and invest program that's the central tenet, it's like overarching, is because it sets a cap that thereby we have to gradually ratchet down emissions. Like, we've made progress in the electric sector because we've obligated the electric sector to get cleaner every year. And we don't have those same tools in our two largest polluting sectors. So overarching, it's intent, and we've recognized that in our addendum to the climate action plan, just looking across the world, like, other jurisdictions have not made progress unless they had a cap and invest program or something like a performance standard that sets a trajectory. So again, I'm not necessarily, but that's sort of like, for me, it was like, it's an overarching policy under which other things fit.
The keystone holds up the arch,
Yeah,
but
I'm not,
so you can't have an arch without all the other stones.
Don't fight, like, but just in terms of it, the importance of it and the rationale, and it tracks through 15 years of Vermont.
So we should break for lunch. I think, you know, I think what many of you are sitting with right now is like, how do I feel about recommending Cap and Invest as the sort of keystone policy at the front of this? Like, how is that making me feel? And just to be clear, right, in addition to this sort of final note here, there are a set of recommendations that are sort of now recommendations about transportation stuff, the electricity pieces here that we haven't changed in quite some time, those 3 electricity ones, funding, secure funding for comprehensive weatherization, right, is here. It's one of our important strategies here. We still have an X in weatherization on for commercial, industrial, municipal. Talk about that in a bunch. And we've got the electrification of space and water heating. And then we've got 2 sort of analyze or conduct studies, right? One is on equipment standards and the other is on clean fuels standard, right? But those are more hedged, like, you know, look into this because this could be complementary to us above. All right, so just that's the suite, right, of what we got in there. Yeah.
I know we're trying to break for lunch and this is where you do the big eye roll, everybody, but like, I missed a couple. Did we already agree that that is like the keystone policy, like that we are making that recommendation as a group on the Cap and Invest? I thought we were kind of voting today, I guess.
Right. So what we are later today trying to lift up a top 10 kind of thing, right?
Right.
So the fact that it's up here, talked about as a keystone, let's see if it makes our top 10.
Okay.
However, there is